Hey there, welcome to Broaderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Demonic contract. Have you ever been so desperate that you would do anything to change your life, even if it meant risking your soul? That's where I found myself, not long ago, but it feels like a lifetime. It all started when I was at the lowest point in my life, both financially and emotionally. My business had failed, my savings were gone, and I was drowning in debt. Every phone call was a reminder of how far I had fallen, and I couldn't see any way out. I remember sitting in my dark, cluttered apartment, feeling the weight of my failure pressing down on me. The bills were piling up on the kitchen counter, unopened, because I knew what they all said, numbers I couldn't possibly pay. My fridge was empty except for a few cans of beer and some leftovers that had gone bad days ago. I was avoiding friends and family, too ashamed to admit how badly things had turned out. One night, after another string of failed job interviews, I sat at my desk, scrolling mindlessly through the internet, hoping to distract myself. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something to take my mind off my misery. But then, I stumbled across a discussion forum. The title caught my eye. Deals with the devil, fact or fiction? I clicked on it without thinking. The thread was filled with stories, some obviously fake, others so strange they seemed almost plausible. People were talking about how they had made pacts with dark forces, trading their souls for money, power, or fame. It was all ridiculous, of course. At least, that's what I told myself. But something about those stories lingered in my mind. Late that night, when sleep wouldn't come, I thought about those stories again. I couldn't shake the idea. What if there was some truth to it? What if there really was a way out of my hopeless situation? I laughed at myself for even entertaining the thought. I wasn't religious, not even superstitious. But as the hours ticked by, and the darkness in my apartment seemed to grow heavier, I started to wonder, what if it's real? The next day, I found myself searching for more information. I told myself it was just curiosity, just something to pass the time. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed something, anything, to change my life. The more I read, the more convinced I became that there was a way to make contact with something. I found old rituals, written in languages I didn't understand, forums filled with cryptic advice on how to summon dark entities. It all seemed so far-fetched, and yet there was a part of me that wanted to believe. The part of me that was desperate enough to try anything. Late one night, after several drinks and an overwhelming sense of hopelessness, I decided to do it. I gathered the supplies, candles, a mirror, a piece of paper on which I had scrawled my request. The instructions were simple, but they carried a strange, eerie weight. I had to light the candles, stand in front of the mirror, and speak the words aloud. As I did, I couldn't help but feel ridiculous. This was nonsense. I was just a fool, wasting time. But then, something changed. The room felt different. The air grew colder, and the flickering candlelight cast strange shadows on the walls. I glanced at the mirror, expecting to see nothing but my own reflection, but the image staring back at me wasn't quite right. My reflection seemed darker, more distorted, as if something was watching me from the other side. And then, I heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. What do you want? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. But the whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. What do you want? My mouth went dry. My first instinct was to blow out the candles, turn on the lights, and pretend this had never happened. But I couldn't move. Something kept me rooted to the spot, staring into the darkened mirror. And then, as if someone else was speaking through me, the words came out. I want wealth. I want success. The whisper responded almost immediately. And what will you give in return? I hesitated. This was insane. I was talking to a mirror, asking for wealth like some character in a bad horror movie. But before I could stop myself, I spoke again. Anything. The moment the word left my mouth, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candle flames flickered violently, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and contort. For a split second, I thought I saw something in the mirror, something inhuman, with glowing eyes and a twisted smile. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The candles burned steadily, the air warmed, and the strange, oppressive feeling lifted. It was over. I stood there for a long time, staring at my reflection, wondering what had just happened. Had I really made a deal? Was there really something on the other side that had heard my request? I shook my head, laughing at my own foolishness. This was all in my head. There was no demon, no contract. Just my own desperation playing tricks on me. But then, the next day, things started to change. It was subtle at first, small things that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been looking for them. I got a call from an old friend, offering me a job out of the blue. A distant relative left me a small inheritance. My investments, which had been tanking for months, suddenly shot up in value. Within a week, my entire life had turned around. The debt collectors stopped calling, my bank account was flush with cash, and opportunities seemed to fall into my lap. It was everything I had asked for, everything I had dreamed of. But with every success came a growing sense of unease. It was too easy, too perfect. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was just luck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something that was waiting for its payment. The first few weeks were like a dream. Everything was falling into place in a way that defied logic. I had always heard that hard work and persistence paid off, but this felt different. It was as if the universe itself had bent to my will, rearranging the pieces of my life to fit the image I had longed for. My new job was better than I could have imagined. It wasn't just the money, though that part was almost absurd. Every deal I touched turned into gold. Clients who were once elusive now sought me out, eager to work with me. My boss, who had barely remembered my name before, started inviting me to exclusive meetings, treating me like I was some sort of rising star. Even my social life improved. I was suddenly surrounded by people who seemed to hang on my every word. Friends I hadn't heard from in years started reaching out, and strangers at bars or parties seemed inexplicably drawn to me. The isolation and shame that had weighed me down for so long were gone, replaced by a constant buzz of admiration and success. And yet, underneath it all, there was a shadow I couldn't ignore. At first, it was just a sense of being watched. It started the morning after I made the deal, a prickling at the back of my neck, like eyes were always on me. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. After all, I had gotten what I wanted, hadn't I? But the feeling persisted. It didn't matter where I was, at home, at work, out with friends, the sensation followed me, a constant reminder that my newfound success wasn't free. Then the dreams began. They were subtle at first, nothing more than fleeting images that vanished as soon as I opened my eyes. But over time, they grew more vivid, more disturbing. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, the echoes of a voice still ringing in my ears. It was always the same whisper. Remember your promise. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just guilt, just my mind playing tricks on me because I had gotten lucky. But deep down, I knew better. I had made a promise that night, and whatever entity had answered me was waiting for me to make good on it. One night, as I sat in my living room, staring blankly at the television, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't in a dream. It was real, clear, and unmistakable. Time is running out. I froze. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath in the air, my heart hammering in my chest as I glanced around, trying to find the source of the voice. But there was no one there. The room was empty, except for the faint flicker of the television screen. Time is running out, the voice repeated, and this time it felt closer, almost like it was coming from within me. I jumped up, turned on every light in the house, and stood in the middle of the room, panting. My hands were shaking, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It was just stress, just my imagination running wild. But the voice, the whisper, it felt too real to ignore. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same twisted smile, the same glowing eyes staring back at me from the dark. The demon, if that's what it was, wasn't going to let me forget our deal. And no matter how much I tried to push it to the back of my mind, I knew it was only a matter of time before I had to pay. A few days later, things took a turn for the worse. It started small, little things going wrong that I couldn't explain. My phone would ring in the middle of the night, but when I answered, there was no one on the line, just static. Lights in my apartment would flicker, even though the bulbs were new. Objects moved from where I had left them, and strange, almost inaudible whispers followed me wherever I went. But the worst part was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just a vague sense anymore. It was constant, oppressive, like eyes were always on me, no matter where I went or what I did. I started avoiding mirrors, because every time I looked into one, I thought I saw something moving just behind me, a shadow, a flicker of something that didn't belong. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the whispers, the sense that I was slowly losing my grip on reality, it all became too much. I sat in front of the mirror, the same mirror I had used the night I made the deal, and I demanded answers. "What do you want from me?" I shouted into the empty room, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. "I've done everything you asked. I made the deal." For a long moment, there was silence. I sat there, breathing heavily, my eyes locked on the reflection in the mirror. And then, slowly, the room around me seemed to darken, the shadows creeping in from the edges of my vision until all I could see was the faint outline of my own face in the glass. "You owe me," the voice whispered, soft but unmistakable. "And now it's time to pay." I recoiled, scrambling to my feet as the temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows in the mirror twisted, forming shapes that I couldn't quite make out, figures, faces, eyes staring back at me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. "What do you want?" I stammered, backing away from the mirror. "You know the price," the voice said, and this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. I shook my head, panic surging through me. I didn't know what I had agreed to. I had been desperate, drunk, out of options. But now, standing in the middle of my apartment, surrounded by shadows and whispers, I realized the truth. I had made a deal with something far more dangerous than I could ever have imagined. And there was no way out. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of excess. Every penny I touched seemed to multiply. My business, which had been struggling to stay afloat, flourished in ways that defied logic. Clients appeared out of nowhere, deals were struck with impossible ease, and my bank account swelled to an unimaginable figure. The sensation of invincibility began to cloud my judgment. I felt untouchable, like the universe had finally bent to my will. But something else had shifted, too. At first, it was subtle, whispers at the edge of my hearing, barely perceptible, like someone muttering under their breath. I told myself it was stress, maybe fatigue from working so hard to maintain this newfound fortune. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. No matter where I was, in my office, at home, even in my car, I could hear it, a soft, insistent voice. One night, as I sat alone in my living room, enjoying a glass of whiskey, the voice became undeniable. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was calling my name. Marcus. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But the room was empty, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fireplace. My heart pounded as the voice called out again, this time louder. Marcus. I stood up, my breath shallow, and peered into the dark corners of the room. There was nothing there. No one. Who's there? My voice cracked as I spoke, fear creeping in. Silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of laughter, low, guttural, and mocking. My blood ran cold. I knew, deep down, what was happening. I had made a deal, and now it was time to pay the price. But I wasn't ready to admit that to myself just yet. I had to believe that I could still control this situation. That this was just some kind of hallucination or a trick my mind was playing on me. I stumbled upstairs to my bedroom, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. As I lay in bed, the voice didn't follow me. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, at exactly midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hall outside my bedroom door. My heart raced as I stared at the ceiling, too terrified to move. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and then, nothing. I waited, holding my breath, expecting the door to creak open for something or someone to enter. But the door remained closed, and the silence was suffocating. When morning finally came, I convinced myself that it had been a dream, a nightmare brought on by too much whiskey and the stress of success. But as the days passed, the phenomena grew more intense. The whispers became voices, the laughter turned to taunts, and the footsteps, they grew closer each night. I started losing sleep, haunted by the constant presence of something unseen. My friends noticed the change in me. I became paranoid, jumpy, always looking over my shoulder. But how could I explain what was happening without sounding insane? How could I tell them that I had made a deal with a demon and now it was collecting its due? The fortune I had gained now felt like a curse. Every dollar I spent seemed tainted, a reminder of the price I had agreed to pay. I tried to ignore it, tried to drown myself in work and distractions, but the voices never left me. They were always there, just out of reach, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. Then, one night, everything changed. I was sitting at my desk, going over some paperwork, when the room suddenly grew cold. I looked up to see the fireplace flickering weakly, as if the flames were struggling to stay alive. And then, Out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was him. The man from the mirror. The demon. He stood there, his eyes burning with an otherworldly fire, his smile twisted into something sinister. "Time's up, Marcus," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. I backed away, my chair scraping against the floor. "What do you want?" "You know what I want," he replied, taking a step closer. "You made a deal. Now it's time to fulfill your end of the bargain." My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to think of a way out, but there was no escape. I had known from the moment I signed that contract that this day would come. I just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "Please," I begged, my voice shaking. "There has to be another way." The demon laughed, a cold, heartless sound. "You can't cheat fate, Marcus. You wanted wealth, and I gave it to you. Now you must give me what I'm owed." I stared at him, my mind racing. What did he want? My soul? My life? The thought of losing everything terrified me, but there was no turning back now. As the demon moved closer, I felt a cold, suffocating darkness wrap around me. My body froze in place, and my vision blurred. I could hear the voices again, louder this time, chanting my name, mocking me for thinking I could ever escape this fate. And then, everything went black. I woke up in total darkness, the kind of blackness that seems to consume everything, even sound. My body felt heavy, like it was weighed down by an invisible force. Panic surged through me as I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't respond. It was as if I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. For what felt like hours, I lay there in the oppressive silence, my mind racing. Where was I? Was this some kind of purgatory? Was I dead? The thought sent a jolt of terror through me, but just as I was about to scream, I heard it, soft at first, but growing louder. A voice. Not the mocking laughter I had grown used to, but something else, something colder. "Marcus." It whispered, drawing out my name like it enjoyed the taste of it. "You can't hide forever." I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I was left there, listening to the voice surround me, closing in like a predator stalking its prey. And then, out of nowhere, a bright, blinding light pierced through the darkness. I squinted, trying to make out where it was coming from, but the light was so intense it hurt my eyes. As it grew closer, the oppressive weight on my body lifted, and suddenly, I could move again. Without thinking, I stumbled to my feet and ran toward the light, desperate for some kind of escape. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed forward, my legs aching with every step. But as I neared the light, something stopped me dead in my tracks. The demon. He stood there, bathed in the eerie glow, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. I froze, fear choking me as I realized there was no escaping him. This was it. This was the end. "You can't run from me, Marcus," he continued, taking a step closer. "We had a deal, remember?" I shook my head, backing away. "Please. I'll give it all back. The money, the success, just let me go." The demon laughed, a sound so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. "It's too late for that. The contract has already been fulfilled. Your soul belongs to me now." His words echoed in my head, each one sinking deeper, like a knife twisting in my gut. I wanted to scream, to beg, but I knew it was useless. I had made a choice, and now I had to face the consequences. "You should have known, Marcus," the demon said, his voice suddenly softer, almost pitying. "There's always a price." With those words, the light around him dimmed, and the darkness closed in once more. I felt my body grow heavy again, my limbs turning to lead. As the demon disappeared into the shadows, the weight of my decision crashed down on me. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone. Time became meaningless in that void. Days, weeks, maybe even months passed, and I drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped in a limbo where the only constant was the crushing sense of regret. I thought about my life, about all the choices that had led me here, and I realized, too late, that I had been chasing the wrong things all along. Wealth, power, success. It had all seemed so important at the time, but now, none of it mattered. In the end, all I had gained was an eternity of torment. And then, one day, something changed. I don't know how long I had been trapped in that void, but suddenly, I felt a shift, a disturbance in the suffocating darkness. A soft, warm light flickered in the distance, faint but steady. It was different from the blinding light I had chased before. This one felt calming, almost peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, I moved toward it, cautiously, unsure if this was another trick. But the closer I got, the stronger the warmth grew, wrapping around me like a protective blanket. It was then that I realized this wasn't the demon. This was something else, something good. As I stepped into the light, I felt the weight of my sins lift, and for the first time since that fateful deal, I felt free. But freedom came at a cost. The life I had known, the wealth, the power, it was all gone. I had nothing. I was nothing. But in that moment, I understood the real price of the contract I had signed. It wasn't just my soul the demon had taken. It was everything that had made me who I was. I had been given a second chance, but at what cost? I no longer knew who I was or where I belonged. The world I had once known was a distant memory, and the man I had become was a ghost of his former self. As I walked through the light, leaving the darkness behind, I couldn't help but wonder, was this truly freedom? Or was it just another kind of prison, one where the bars were made of my own regrets? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, I would never, ever make a deal like that again. The ghost of the little girl. Do you believe in ghosts? That was the question that flickered in my mind when we first moved into the house. It was an old place, the kind with creaking wooden floors and a fireplace that hadn't seen fire in decades. The kind of house where the walls seemed to whisper with the weight of untold stories. It was exactly the kind of place we had dreamed of, a quiet, peaceful home where we could start our new chapter. But none of the brochures, none of the enthusiastic descriptions from the realtor had prepared us for what came after. It all started the first night. We had just finished unpacking, and I remember collapsing onto the couch, exhausted but content. The house felt empty, but in a good way, as if it was ready to be filled with our lives, our memories. My partner, Grace, had already gone upstairs, excited to claim one of the bedrooms as her art studio. The night was calm, the kind of stillness that wraps around you like a warm blanket. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A quiet creak from upstairs, which I chalked up to the house settling. Old houses make noise, right? That's what I told myself. I ignored the sound, choosing instead to focus on the crackling of the fire I had lit in the living room. I sat there, watching the flames dance, trying to shake the sense of unease creeping up my spine. The creaks grew louder, more frequent, but I stubbornly refused to acknowledge them. Then came the sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, and deliberate. They moved across the ceiling above me, pacing back and forth as if someone was wandering aimlessly from room to room. My heart raced, and for the first time, I felt the undeniable presence of something else. But I tried to rationalize it. "It's just Grace," I whispered to myself. "She's probably looking for something." The footsteps paused, and a long, drawn-out silence followed. Then, a faint giggle echoed down the stairs, so soft it could have easily been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't. I stood up, my skin crawling with the icy grip of fear. "Grace?" I called out, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed me. It quivered, shaking with uncertainty. There was no response. I took a deep breath and headed for the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house seemed darker now, the shadows in the corners stretching longer, as if they were reaching out toward me. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something odd. The hallway light was off, but I had sworn I had left it on. My hand hovered over the switch, and just as I was about to flip it, I heard it again. The giggle. Only this time, it was clearer. Closer. It was the sound of a child's laughter, innocent and light, but in that moment, it was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed down the hallway toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the dim light from Grace's lamp spilling out into the hallway. "Grace?" I called again, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open and froze. There, standing in the center of the room, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with long dark hair and pale skin. She was wearing a simple white dress, the kind you might see in old photographs from the early 1900s. Her back was to me, but I could hear her soft humming, a haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The room felt impossibly cold, the air heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. I wanted to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt like it had seeped into my bones. The girl slowly turned to face me, and as her eyes met mine, my blood ran cold. They were empty. Not in the sense that they were void of emotion, but physically empty, dark, hollow sockets where her eyes should have been. Her pale lips curved into a small, sad smile, and she took a step toward me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it echoed in my mind like a scream. I stumbled back, my legs finally responding, and crashed into the hallway wall. My head spun, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. But before I could move again, the door to the bedroom slammed shut with a force that shook the house. The sudden silence was deafening. I stood there, gasping for air, my body trembling as the weight of the moment pressed down on me. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of waking nightmare? I couldn't explain it, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in this house. Something that wasn't alive. I barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jolt awake, expecting to see her, the little girl with the hollow eyes. I wanted to tell Grace, but how do you explain something like that? How do you say out loud that you've seen a ghost and not sound insane? I didn't even fully believe it myself, yet the terror I felt was very real. The morning brought a false sense of calm. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the house in a warm glow. It seemed impossible that the events of the previous night had even happened. For a moment, I convinced myself it had all been a dream. But the uneasy feeling lingered at the edges of my mind like a dark shadow that refused to fade. The ghost of the little girl. Do you believe in ghosts? That was the question that flickered in my mind when we first moved into the house. It was an old place, the kind with creaking wooden floors and a fireplace that hadn't seen fire in decades. The kind of house where the walls seemed to whisper with the weight of untold stories. It was exactly the kind of place we had dreamed of, a quiet, peaceful home where we could start our new chapter. But none of the brochures, none of the enthusiastic descriptions from the realtor had prepared us for what came after. It all started the first night. We had just finished unpacking, and I remember collapsing onto the couch, exhausted but content. The house felt empty, but in a good way, as if it was ready to be filled with our lives, our memories. My partner, Grace, had already gone upstairs, excited to claim one of the bedrooms as her art studio. The night was calm, the kind of stillness that wraps around you like a warm blanket. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A quiet creak from upstairs, which I chalked up to the house settling. Old houses make noise, right? That's what I told myself. I ignored the sound, choosing instead to focus on the crackling of the fire I had lit in the living room. I sat there, watching the flames dance, trying to shake the sense of unease creeping up my spine. The creaks grew louder, more frequent, but I stubbornly refused to acknowledge them. Then came the sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, and deliberate. They moved across the ceiling above me, pacing back and forth as if someone was wandering aimlessly from room to room. My heart raced, and for the first time, I felt the undeniable presence of something else. But I tried to rationalize it. It's just Grace, I whispered to myself. She's probably looking for something. The footsteps paused, and a long, drawn-out silence followed. Then, a faint giggle echoed down the stairs, so soft it could have easily been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't. I stood up, my skin crawling with the icy grip of fear. Grace? I called out, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed me. It quivered, shaking with uncertainty. There was no response. I took a deep breath and headed for the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house seemed darker now, the shadows in the corners stretching longer, as if they were reaching out toward me. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something odd. The hallway light was off, but I had sworn I had left it on. My hand hovered over the switch, and just as I was about to flip it, I heard it again. The giggle. Only this time, it was clearer. Closer. It was the sound of a child's laughter, innocent and light, but in that moment, it was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed down the hallway toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the dim light from Grace's lamp spilling out into the hallway. Grace? I called again, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open and froze. There, standing in the center of the room, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with long dark hair and pale skin. She was wearing a simple white dress, the kind you might see in old photographs from the early 1900s. Her back was to me, but I could hear her soft humming, a haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The room felt impossibly cold, the air heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. I wanted to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt like it had seeped into my bones. The girl slowly turned to face me, and as her eyes met mine, my blood ran cold. They were empty. Not in the sense that they were void of emotion, but physically empty, dark, hollow sockets where her eyes should have been. Her pale lips curved into a small, sad smile, and she took a step toward me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it echoed in my mind like a scream. I stumbled back, my legs finally responding, and crashed into the hallway wall. My head spun, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. But before I could move again, the door to the bedroom slammed shut with a force that shook the house. The sudden silence was deafening. I stood there, gasping for air, my body trembling as the weight of the moment pressed down on me. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of waking nightmare? I couldn't explain it, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in this house. Something that wasn't alive. I barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jolt awake, expecting to see her, the little girl with the hollow eyes. I wanted to tell Grace, but how do you explain something like that? How do you say out loud that you've seen a ghost and not sound insane? I didn't even fully believe it myself, yet the terror I felt was very real. The morning brought a false sense of calm. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the house in a warm glow. It seemed impossible that the events of the previous night had even happened. For a moment, I convinced myself it had all been a dream. But the uneasy feeling lingered at the edges of my mind like a dark shadow that refused to fade. The house was filled with laughter and chatter, and for a brief moment, I managed to forget about the girl. I engaged in conversation and made polite small talk, but a part of me remained vigilant, alert for any sign of her return. As the night wore on, I excused myself and went to the bathroom, seeking a moment of solitude. As I washed my hands, the bathroom door creaked open behind me. I turned, expecting to see one of the guests, but the room was empty. I dismissed it as a draft and returned to the mirror. It wasn't until I noticed that the mirror's surface was fogged up with condensation that I saw her. The little girl's face appeared on the mirror, her hollow eyes staring out at me from within the mist. She was smiling, but there was no warmth in her expression, only a hollow, chilling emptiness. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of shampoo. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the image from my mind, but the girl remained there, a ghostly specter in the mirror. Her tiny hands seemed to reach out toward me, and her silent plea echoed in my ears. "Help me," she whispered again, the sound barely audible over the noise of the party. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was still empty. I could hear the muffled voices of our guests through the door, but the ghostly apparition was gone. My hands trembled as I wiped the fog off the mirror, but there was no trace of her remaining. I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself, and quickly left the bathroom, making my way back to the party. I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks as I tried to ignore the pounding in my head. Grace caught my eye and gave me a worried glance, but I forced a smile and reassured her that I was fine. As the night went on, the sense of dread grew heavier. The party guests eventually left, and Grace and I were left alone in the quiet house. The silence was almost deafening, and I found myself unable to relax. "Are you sure you're okay?" Grace asked as we cleaned up. "You seemed off tonight." I hesitated, weighing my words carefully. "I've just been stressed, I guess. It's been a lot to adjust to." Grace nodded, though I could see the concern in her eyes. "If you need to talk about anything, I'm here." Her words were comforting, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the ghost. Not yet. The fear that gripped me was too strong, and I didn't want to alarm her more than necessary. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I found it impossible to sleep. The memory of the girl's face in the mirror haunted me, and every creak of the house seemed to echo with her presence. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? And what did she want from me? I finally drifted off into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by the sound of something crashing downstairs. My heart leaped into my throat, and I sat up, listening intently. The house was eerily silent again, but I knew something wasn't right. I slipped out of bed and carefully made my way downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. I reached the bottom of the stairs and noticed the hallway light flickering, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to move forward. As I reached the living room, I saw the source of the noise. A vase had fallen from the mantel, shattering into pieces on the floor. I knelt to clean up the mess, my hands trembling, when I heard a soft, childlike giggle behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The temperature seemed to drop, and I could see my breath misting in the cold air. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to find any sign of the girl, but there was nothing. I had a sudden, overwhelming feeling that she was closer than ever before. The fear that had been building inside me reached a crescendo, and I felt a cold, invisible hand brush against my shoulder. I jumped up, gasping, and turned to face the empty room. The feeling of being watched was intense, almost suffocating. I stumbled back to the stairs, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I had to get out of there. I had to find a way to get rid of her. As I made my way back to the safety of my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly presence was following me, lingering just out of sight. The little girl's ghost was more than just a fleeting apparition. She was something more sinister, and I was caught in her web of sorrow and confusion. I spent the rest of the night in a restless, fitful sleep, haunted by nightmares of the little girl's ghost. Each time I closed my eyes, I was plunged into a foggy world where her hollow eyes followed me relentlessly. I woke up multiple times, drenched in sweat, with my heart pounding. When morning finally came, I felt like a walking zombie, drained by the night's terror. Grace, noticing my exhausted state, suggested we go out for brunch to take my mind off things. I was grateful for the distraction, but my mind remained preoccupied with the girl's ghostly presence. The sun was shining brightly, and the cafe was filled with the comforting hum of conversation and clinking dishes, but the anxiety never left me. As we ate, Grace chatted animatedly about her plans for decorating the house, but I struggled to focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the ghost and the eerie occurrences in our home. I tried to act interested and engaged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was looming. After brunch, Grace decided to head to a local farmer's market. I agreed to join her, hoping that the activity would help clear my mind. The market was bustling with people, and the vibrant colors and fresh produce offered a temporary escape from my growing unease. But even amidst the crowd, the feeling of dread lingered. I couldn't help but notice how the shadows seemed to shift and warp in unsettling ways, and the sounds of laughter and chatter seemed to be tinged with an underlying sense of menace. I tried to push these thoughts away, reminding myself that I was just letting my fear get the better of me. Later that evening, as we returned home, I felt a sense of foreboding. The house, which had once felt like a haven, now seemed like a trap closing in on me. I was anxious to find some way to confront the ghost, but every attempt to broach the subject with Grace was met with polite but concerned responses. When night fell, I knew I had to take action. I had to confront the ghost and find out what she wanted from me. As Grace went to bed, I stayed downstairs, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead. I decided to start with the living room, where the vase had fallen. I methodically examined the room, looking for any clues or signs that might explain the ghost's presence. As I moved furniture and checked every corner, I came across an old, dusty photo album tucked away behind a bookcase. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, and the photographs depicted a family from decades ago, a mother, a father, and a young girl. The girl in the photos was unmistakably similar to the ghostly apparition I had seen. My heart raced as I flipped through the album, and my eyes widened at the last photograph, a grainy, sepia-toned image of the family standing in front of the house. The photo was dated from the early 1920s. I recognized the house in the picture. It was our house. This was a family who had lived here long before us, and their daughter had the same haunting eyes as the ghost. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the girl's ghost was connected to this family. I needed more information. I searched through the rest of the album, hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the girl, but the album ended with no explanation. Determined to uncover more, I decided to do some research about the house's history. I spent hours online, digging through old newspapers and archives. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon a news article from the early 1920s about a tragic event in our house. A young girl had gone missing, and despite extensive searches, she was never found. Her disappearance was a mystery that remained unsolved. The article mentioned that the girl's name was Emily. As I read through the details, it became clear that Emily's disappearance had left her family devastated. Her father had died shortly after, and her mother had moved away, leaving the house abandoned for years. I sat back, feeling the weight of the information sink in. Emily's spirit was trapped in the house, unable to move on because her death had never been resolved. She was looking for answers, and it seemed that I was the only one who could help her. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I decided to perform a simple ritual to communicate with Emily's spirit and offer her the closure she needed. I set up a quiet space in the living room, lighting a few candles and placing the photo album on a small table. I took a deep breath and began to speak aloud, addressing Emily directly. Emily, if you can hear me, I want to help you find peace. I know your story, and I'm here to listen. Please, tell me what you need. As I spoke, I felt a cold breeze pass through the room, and the flickering candle flames wavered. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation, and I could almost feel Emily's presence surrounding me. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and a soft, childlike voice whispered in my ear. Help me find my mother. My heart ached at the words. Emily's mother had left the house after her disappearance, and finding her now would be impossible. But I had to try. I vowed to search for any leads that might help resolve Emily's case. Over the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly to track down any surviving relatives or records related to Emily's family. My efforts led me to a distant relative who was still alive and had some knowledge of the family history. I contacted them and shared what I had learned, hoping they could provide additional information. The relative was shocked by my findings and agreed to help. Together, we traced the family's history and eventually discovered that Emily's mother had passed away many years ago. However, there were still some distant relatives who were interested in preserving the family's memory and helping resolve the case. With their assistance, we were able to hold a small memorial service for Emily, honoring her memory and acknowledging the pain her family had suffered. The service brought a sense of closure and peace to the house, and I felt Emily's presence begin to fade. The day after the memorial, as I sat in the living room, I felt a profound sense of relief. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the house was gone, and the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. I could almost sense Emily's spirit moving on, finally free from the chains that had bound her to this world. Grace noticed the change and remarked on how much lighter the house felt. I didn't go into details about the ghost or the events that had transpired, but I could see the difference in her eyes. The house was now a place of calm and tranquility, and I knew that Emily had found her peace. I still think about Emily from time to time and wonder if she's finally with her family. The experience was harrowing, but it taught me the importance of listening and helping those who are lost, even when their voices are faint and distant. The house, once a source of fear, had become a place of healing, and I felt grateful for the chance to make things right. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to spend a night in a place where history's shadows linger just out of sight? That was the question I found myself grappling with as I checked into room 14 of the old Oak Ridge Hotel. It was a quaint establishment nestled in the heart of a small, sleepy town, far removed from the bustling chaos of city life. I had booked this stay as a way to escape the constant noise and stress of my daily routine, hoping for a peaceful retreat. But as I would soon discover, this room held a history that was anything but serene. The Oak Ridge Hotel had a reputation, one that wasn't widely known but whispered among the locals. Tales of inexplicable occurrences, fleeting glimpses of figures in the corners of your vision, and an ever-present sense of being watched. I had read about these stories, of course, but I dismissed them as mere folklore. Little did I know that by choosing this particular hotel, I was about to become a part of that very lore. Upon arrival, the hotel's antique charm was undeniable. The grand lobby, with its polished wooden floors and ornate chandeliers, was a testament to a bygone era. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, handed me the key to room 14, a room that was, as she casually mentioned, one of the older ones in the building. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, as she mentioned that the room had been recently renovated. Her gaze lingered on me just a bit too long, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her words than she was letting on. I took the ancient elevator up to the third floor, its creaking cables and occasional jolts only adding to the building's old-world atmosphere. As the doors opened with a reluctant groan, I was greeted by a dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the faint aroma of mildew clung to the air. Room 14 was at the end of the hall, and as I approached, I couldn't help but notice how the corridor seemed to grow colder. Entering the room, I was immediately struck by its charm: an old-fashioned four-poster bed, a heavy velvet drape over the window, and a large, ornate mirror that dominated the far wall. The mirror was an antique, with a gold frame intricately carved with patterns that hinted at a bygone grandeur. It seemed out of place, almost too pristine amidst the otherwise aged decor. The room itself was comfortable, but I noticed a distinct chill that seemed to emanate from the mirror. I brushed it off as a draft, attributing it to the age of the building. The initial unease I felt was soon overshadowed by the relief of having a peaceful place to unwind. I unpacked my things and settled into a comfortable armchair by the window, where I spent the evening reading. It wasn't until later that night, as I lay in bed, that the true strangeness of the room began to reveal itself. I was drifting in and out of sleep when I heard a soft whispering, like a distant conversation just beyond my hearing. I jolted awake, the sound fading as quickly as it had come. The room was silent, save for the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. I told myself it was just the building settling, an explanation I clung to as I tried to return to sleep. As I lay there, unable to fully relax, I found my gaze drawn back to the mirror. It was then that I noticed something peculiar. The reflection of the room seemed slightly off, as if the mirror's image didn't perfectly match the room itself. There was a momentary distortion, a flicker of something dark at the edge of the reflection, but when I blinked, it was gone. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by fleeting dreams and restless shifting. I awoke early the next morning, feeling as though I had barely slept. The hotel's breakfast was a modest affair, simple, but with an old-world charm that matched the rest of the establishment. I joined a few other guests, their conversations punctuated by the occasional, curious glance in my direction. It seemed that I wasn't the only one who felt a sense of unease. As I made my way back to my room, I decided to investigate the history of the hotel. The receptionist from the previous day was nowhere to be seen, and the new attendant, a young man with a cheerful disposition, was not very forthcoming with information. I managed to find a dusty old ledger in the hotel's small library. Flipping through its pages, I found references to various renovations and changes over the years. There was, however, one entry that caught my eye, a brief mention of a tragic accident involving a previous guest who had died under mysterious circumstances. The ledger was not very detailed, but it was enough to plant a seed of curiosity in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder if the whispers I had heard and the odd reflections in the mirror were connected to this unresolved history. It was clear that something unsettling lurked beneath the surface of the Oak Ridge Hotel's polished exterior. As night fell once more, I prepared for another evening in room 14, my curiosity mingled with a growing sense of apprehension. The room seemed different this time, as if it were aware of my awareness. The chill in the air was more pronounced, and the mirror, now reflecting the soft glow of the bedside lamp, seemed almost to hum with an unseen energy. I resolved to stay awake this night, determined to uncover the source of the disturbances. Little did I know that what lay ahead would challenge my understanding of reality and test my resolve in ways I had never imagined. What would you do if the very room you were staying in seemed to be hiding secrets from you? That was the question gnawing at my mind as I prepared for another night in room 14. The day had been uneventful, but the sense of foreboding was impossible to ignore. I spent much of the afternoon wandering around the town, trying to distract myself from the strange occurrences at the hotel. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to spend a night in a place where history's shadows linger just out of sight? That was the question I found myself grappling with as I checked into room 14 of the old Oak Ridge Hotel. It was a quaint establishment nestled in the heart of a small, sleepy town, far removed from the bustling chaos of city life. I had booked this stay as a way to escape the constant noise and stress of my daily routine, hoping for a peaceful retreat. But as I would soon discover, this room held a history that was anything but serene. The Oak Ridge Hotel had a reputation, one that wasn't widely known but whispered among the locals. Tales of inexplicable occurrences, fleeting glimpses of figures in the corners of your vision, and an ever-present sense of being watched. I had read about these stories, of course, but I dismissed them as mere folklore. Little did I know that by choosing this particular hotel, I was about to become a part of that very lore. Upon arrival, the hotel's antique charm was undeniable. The grand lobby, with its polished wooden floors and ornate chandeliers, was a testament to a bygone era. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, handed me the key to room 14, a room that was, as she casually mentioned, one of the older ones in the building. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, as she mentioned that the room had been recently renovated. Her gaze lingered on me just a bit too long, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her words than she was letting on. I took the ancient elevator up to the third floor, its creaking cables and occasional jolts only adding to the building's old-world atmosphere. As the doors opened with a reluctant groan, I was greeted by a dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the faint aroma of mildew clung to the air. Room 14 was at the end of the hall, and as I approached, I couldn't help but notice how the corridor seemed to grow colder. Entering the room, I was immediately struck by its charm: an old-fashioned four-poster bed, a heavy velvet drape over the window, and a large, ornate mirror that dominated the far wall. The mirror was an antique, with a gold frame intricately carved with patterns that hinted at a bygone grandeur. It seemed out of place, almost too pristine amidst the otherwise aged decor. The room itself was comfortable, but I noticed a distinct chill that seemed to emanate from the mirror. I brushed it off as a draft, attributing it to the age of the building. The initial unease I felt was soon overshadowed by the relief of having a peaceful place to unwind. I unpacked my things and settled into a comfortable armchair by the window, where I spent the evening reading. It wasn't until later that night, as I lay in bed, that the true strangeness of the room began to reveal itself. I was drifting in and out of sleep when I heard a soft whispering, like a distant conversation just beyond my hearing. I jolted awake, the sound fading as quickly as it had come. The room was silent, save for the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. I told myself it was just the building settling, an explanation I clung to as I tried to return to sleep. As I lay there, unable to fully relax, I found my gaze drawn back to the mirror. It was then that I noticed something peculiar. The reflection of the room seemed slightly off, as if the mirror's image didn't perfectly match the room itself. There was a momentary distortion, a flicker of something dark at the edge of the reflection, but when I blinked, it was gone. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by fleeting dreams and restless shifting. I awoke early the next morning, feeling as though I had barely slept. The hotel's breakfast was a modest affair, simple, but with an old-world charm that matched the rest of the establishment. I joined a few other guests, their conversations punctuated by the occasional, curious glance in my direction. It seemed that I wasn't the only one who felt a sense of unease. As I made my way back to my room, I decided to investigate the history of the hotel. The receptionist from the previous day was nowhere to be seen, and the new attendant, a young man with a cheerful disposition, was not very forthcoming with information. I managed to find a dusty old ledger in the hotel's small library. Flipping through its pages, I found references to various renovations and changes over the years. There was, however, one entry that caught my eye, a brief mention of a tragic accident involving a previous guest who had died under mysterious circumstances. The ledger was not very detailed, but it was enough to plant a seed of curiosity in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder if the whispers I had heard and the odd reflections in the mirror were connected to this unresolved history. It was clear that something unsettling lurked beneath the surface of the Oak Ridge Hotel's polished exterior. As night fell once more, I prepared for another evening in room 14, my curiosity mingled with a growing sense of apprehension. The room seemed different this time, as if it were aware of my awareness. The chill in the air was more pronounced, and the mirror, now reflecting the soft glow of the bedside lamp, seemed almost to hum with an unseen energy. I resolved to stay awake this night, determined to uncover the source of the disturbances. Little did I know that what lay ahead would challenge my understanding of reality and test my resolve in ways I had never imagined. What would you do if the very room you were staying in seemed to be hiding secrets from you? That was the question gnawing at my mind as I prepared for another night in room 14. The day had been uneventful, but the sense of foreboding was impossible to ignore. I spent much of the afternoon wandering around the town, trying to distract myself from the strange occurrences at the hotel. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. I could not shake the feeling that the room was no longer just a place to sleep but a battleground for something beyond my understanding. My sleep was fitful, and I awoke multiple times to the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to uncover more about the history of the Oak Ridge Hotel. I had a growing sense that the events of the past were somehow replaying themselves, and that I was trapped in the middle of it all. The experience had left me more curious than ever, and I knew that I had to find out what had happened in room 14. As I prepared to leave the room for the day, I took one last look at the mirror. Its reflection seemed to hold a deep, dark secret that I could not quite grasp. I made a silent promise to myself to delve deeper into the hotel's history and uncover the truth behind the strange occurrences. What would you do if the answers you seek lead you to confront the very essence of your fears? That was the dilemma I faced as I ventured deeper into the Oak Ridge Hotel's history, driven by the unsettling events of the previous nights. Determined to find clarity, I spent the day speaking with locals and scouring the town's archives for any records related to the hotel's past. The townspeople were initially reluctant to share much. Their eyes would dart away, and they would offer only vague answers when I inquired about the Oak Ridge Hotel. It was as if the mere mention of the place made them uncomfortable. However, after some persistence, I managed to find an elderly gentleman who seemed more willing to talk. His name was Mr. Thompson, and he had lived in the town all his life. Mr. Thompson's small, cluttered house was filled with old photographs and documents, giving it a timeless quality. As I explained my interest in the hotel's history, his demeanor changed from guarded to curious. He agreed to share what he knew, though his face remained clouded with concern. The Oak Ridge Hotel has been here for over a century, Mr. Thompson began, his voice raspy and filled with age. It's seen its fair share of guests and events, some of which you might find unsettling. He went on to recount stories of the hotel's early days, including tales of a fire that had devastated part of the building in the 1920s. According to him, the fire had claimed several lives, and though the building was rebuilt, some believe that the souls of those who perished never truly left. The fire was one thing, Mr. Thompson continued, but there was another incident that people prefer not to talk about. A young couple, newlyweds, stayed in room 14 many years ago. They were found dead under mysterious circumstances, their bodies seemingly untouched but their faces twisted in terror. It was said that the room had something to do with it, but the details were never fully disclosed. The revelation struck me like a bolt of lightning. It was clear that the rumors I had heard were grounded in a darker reality. Mr. Thompson's account of the newlyweds matched the eerie sensations I had been experiencing. The details of their deaths were left deliberately vague, but the implication was clear: room 14 had a sinister reputation. I left Mr. Thompson's house with a heavy heart, my mind racing with the implications of what I had learned. The story of the newlyweds was a chilling confirmation of the fears that had haunted me since my arrival. I needed to return to the Oak Ridge Hotel, to delve deeper into the mystery of room 14 and to confront whatever malevolent force resided within. As evening approached, I made my way back to the hotel. The atmosphere felt different, more oppressive, as if the building itself was aware of my investigation. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, each step echoing in the silent corridor. The hallways seemed colder than before, and the faint scent of mildew was stronger, as if the air itself was heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. Entering room 14, I was immediately struck by the familiar chill. The mirror, now a source of deep unease, seemed to draw me to it. I approached it with a mix of trepidation and determination, my reflection staring back at me with a look of resolve. I decided to spend the night researching the room, trying to piece together the fragmented history of the Oak Ridge Hotel. I set up a small workspace on the writing desk, pulling out my notes and the information I had gathered. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispering from the previous nights had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that was even more unsettling. Around midnight, I decided to take a break and stood by the window, looking out at the dimly lit street below. The night was quiet, with only the occasional sound of a distant car or a rustling breeze. It was then that I noticed something unusual, a figure standing across the street, partially obscured by the shadows. I squinted, trying to make out who or what it was, but the figure remained indistinct, as if intentionally hiding from view. My heart raced as I turned away from the window, the sense of being watched intensifying. I returned to my notes, but my concentration was shattered by the sound of a faint knocking. It was coming from the wall behind me, rhythmic and deliberate. I spun around, but the room remained still. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. I approached the wall, pressing my ear against it. The sound seemed to be coming from within the room itself, not from the adjacent space. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to reach out from the other side. The intensity of the knocking was both alarming and maddening. I backed away, my mind racing with the implications of what was happening. The room's temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I turned back to the mirror, its surface now rippling as if disturbed by an unseen force. The reflection seemed to shift, revealing a dark shadow that was not present in the room. I could see the outline of what looked like a figure moving within the mirror's depths. I reached out to touch the mirror, but the moment my fingers made contact, the shadowy figure vanished, and the mirror's surface returned to its normal, reflective state. I recoiled in fear, my heart pounding in my chest. The sense of dread that had been building over the past few days was now at its peak. I was caught in a web of fear and mystery, struggling to understand the true nature of what was happening. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to search the room for any clues that might explain the disturbances. I opened the closet, inspected the floorboards, and even looked behind the heavy drapes. Everything seemed ordinary, but the feeling of unease remained, as if the room itself was hiding something. It was then that I noticed something peculiar, a small, hidden compartment in the base of the mirror's frame. I pried it open with a sense of anticipation and fear, revealing a faded envelope. The envelope was old, its edges brittle and yellowed with age. I carefully opened it and found a stack of letters, their ink smudged and barely legible. The letters were written in a hurried scrawl, and they spoke of a desperate plea for help. They mentioned a malevolent presence within the hotel, one that could not be escaped or understood. The final letter was particularly chilling, with a message that seemed to be directed at someone who was trapped in room 14. As I read the letters, I realized that the author was someone who had experienced the same terror that I was now facing. The sense of connection was both comforting and terrifying. The letters provided no clear answers, but deepened the mystery of room 14 and its dark history. I knew that I had to confront the source of this fear head-on. The room, the mirror, and the whispers all seemed to be linked to something far more sinister than I had initially imagined. With the letters in hand, I prepared for another night in room 14, determined to uncover the truth and find a way to escape the oppressive presence that seemed to have taken hold of the room. Have you ever felt like you were on the brink of discovering something so profound it could change everything you thought you knew? That was the sensation coursing through me as I prepared for what I hoped would be the final night in room 14. The letters I had discovered revealed a connection to the hotel's dark past, but they also left many questions unanswered. I knew I needed to confront whatever was lurking within the room and seek a resolution to the mystery that had ensnared me. The night had settled in, and the Oak Ridge Hotel seemed even quieter than before. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and dread. I spent the early evening rereading the letters, trying to piece together the fragmented accounts and decipher the cryptic messages. There was a recurring theme of escape and entrapment, with several references to a hidden force that could not be fully understood or described. As darkness fell, I began to notice that the temperature in the room was plummeting again. The chill was more pronounced than ever, and I could see my breath forming in the air. I lit a few candles and set them around the room, hoping to bring some warmth and light to the oppressive atmosphere. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, adding to the sense of unease. I decided to conduct a final, thorough investigation of the room. I methodically checked every corner, every crevice, searching for anything that might explain the disturbances I had experienced. As I moved the furniture and inspected the walls, I kept my eyes on the mirror, which seemed to be the focal point of the room's strange occurrences. The mirror was still and unremarkable, its surface reflecting only the dim candlelight. I was about to give up my search when I noticed something peculiar about the area behind the mirror. It seemed to be slightly detached from the wall, as if it could be moved. I carefully removed it from its place, revealing a hidden space behind it. The hidden compartment was dark and dusty, filled with old, forgotten items. Among the debris, I found a small wooden box. Its surface was intricately carved with symbols that matched those in the letters. With trembling hands, I opened the box, revealing its contents, a collection of old photographs and personal belongings. The photographs depicted various people and scenes from the hotel's past. Many of them were faded and unclear, but a few were distinct enough to recognize. One photograph stood out in particular, a portrait of a young couple, their faces filled with joy and hope. The image seemed to match the description of the newlyweds whose deaths had been mentioned in Mr. Thompson's story. I also found a diary, its pages yellowed with age. The diary belonged to a woman named Elizabeth, who had stayed at the Oak Ridge Hotel many years ago. Her entries detailed her stay in room 14 and her growing sense of dread. The final entry was particularly chilling. The shadows are closing in. I fear that we are not alone. The mirror, it shows things that are not real, but they feel so true. I must escape before it's too late. The diary's entries painted a picture of escalating fear and desperation. Elizabeth's experiences mirrored my own, but her attempts to escape were ultimately in vain. The last few pages were torn and illegible, but the sense of her terror was palpable. As I read through the diary, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The candles flickered and sputtered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. The mirror seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its reflection growing darker and more distorted. I knew that I had to confront the mirror and whatever was behind it. Gathering my courage, I approached the mirror and placed the photographs and diary on the desk beside it. I faced my own reflection, trying to steady my racing heart. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple, as if reacting to my presence. In a final act of bravery, I spoke aloud, addressing the unseen force that I believed was connected to the mirror. I know there is something here, something you want to reveal. I've uncovered the truth of this place, and I'm not afraid to face it. Show yourself, and let us find peace. As I spoke, the room grew colder still, and a low, mournful wail seemed to emanate from the mirror. The shadows in the room seemed to coalesce, forming shapes that were both familiar and unsettling. I watched in horror as the reflection began to shift, revealing a scene from the past. Old hotel room. The mirror showed a vision of the hotel's lobby in a bygone era, filled with people who appeared anxious and fearful. The young couple from the photograph was among them, their faces filled with dread. The scene played out before me, and I saw the couple being led to room 14, their expressions growing more desperate as they entered the room. The vision shifted, and I saw a dark, formless entity moving through the hotel. It seemed to be feeding on the fear and despair of the guests, its presence palpable and menacing. The entity seemed to be connected to the mirror, using it as a gateway to torment those who stayed in room 14. The vision faded, and I was left staring at my own reflection once more. The room was eerily quiet, and the temperature slowly began to return to normal. The candles had burned out, leaving the room in near darkness. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I knew that the mirror was not merely a reflective surface, but a conduit for the hotel's dark history. The entity that had haunted room 14 was a manifestation of the fears and tragedies that had occurred within the hotel's walls. By confronting it, I had managed to bring some semblance of closure to the restless spirits and to myself. With a heavy heart, I packed up the photographs, diary, and other belongings. I left room 14 for the last time, knowing that I had faced the darkness and emerged with a deeper understanding of the hotel's haunted past. The Oak Ridge Hotel would continue to stand, its secrets hidden behind the walls, but I had found a measure of peace. As I checked out of the hotel and walked into the early morning light, I felt a sense of liberation. The shadows of room 14 had been confronted, and the echoes of the past had finally been acknowledged. I looked back at the hotel one last time, feeling a mixture of relief and sorrow. The Oak Ridge Hotel would remain a place of mystery and fear, but its darkest secrets had been laid bare. Graveyard of Demons. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, even when you were completely alone? I used to think it was just my imagination until that fateful evening when I discovered something that would forever change my understanding of the supernatural. It all began on a chilly autumn night when I decided to visit the old cemetery just outside of town. The cemetery was an unremarkable place during the day, overgrown grass, weathered tombstones, and a general air of abandonment. However, as dusk settled and the shadows stretched, the cemetery took on a different character. There was something undeniably eerie about it, a sensation that tingled on the back of my neck. I had always been a skeptic, attributing any unsettling feelings to the imagination, but this night was different. It started with a sound. I had parked my car at the edge of the cemetery, leaving the headlights on to provide a faint illumination. As I walked past the wrought iron gates, I noticed a soft rustling coming from within. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but as I ventured deeper, the rustling grew louder, as if it were something or someone moving through the underbrush. I paused, my flashlight casting an erratic beam across the gravestones. The chill in the air seemed to grow more intense, and the shadows appeared to shift in unnatural ways. My heart began to race, but I pressed on, driven by a mixture of curiosity and a stubborn determination to disprove the creeping sense of unease that was trying to take hold. As I wandered among the gravestones, I noticed something peculiar. One particular tombstone, almost hidden by ivy, seemed different from the rest. The inscription was barely legible, but I could make out a name and a date: Emily Thompson, born in 1885, died in 1905. It was an old grave, but what caught my attention was the distinct feeling of coldness that emanated from it, like a breath of ice against my skin. I knelt down to inspect the grave more closely, my flashlight flickering erratically. Just as I was about to stand up, I heard a low, mournful whisper. It was so faint that I wasn't sure if I had truly heard it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I strained my ears, trying to discern the source of the sound, but all I could hear was the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. A shiver ran down my spine as I stood up and took a step back. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling: footprints. They were small, almost childlike, and seemed to lead away from the grave. My breath caught in my throat. I was alone in the cemetery, or so I thought, yet these footprints seemed fresh, as if someone had recently walked through the area. The air grew colder still, and I felt a presence that I couldn't see but could certainly feel. It was as if the very ground beneath me was alive with a malevolent force. I turned to leave, but the whispers grew louder, and I could now make out a few words: "Help us, find peace." I froze in my tracks, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, their source hidden in the darkness. My logical mind struggled to rationalize the situation, but the fear I felt was all too real. It was the kind of fear that made your heart pound in your chest and your legs tremble. Desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere, I hurried back towards the entrance. My flashlight flickered ominously as if struggling to illuminate the path ahead. The cemetery seemed to close in on me, the shadows lengthening and the rustling growing louder with each step I took. As I reached the wrought iron gates, I glanced back one last time. The cemetery was now bathed in an unsettling, pale light, and the whispers had stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the eerie sounds that had filled the air moments before. I returned to my car, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The sense of being watched lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I drove home with my eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone sitting in the back seat. That night, sleep did not come easily. I lay awake in my bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the cemetery and the chilling whispers I had heard. Was it my imagination, or had I stumbled upon something truly supernatural? As I tried to calm my racing thoughts, I couldn't help but feel that my visit to the cemetery had awakened something that was not meant to be disturbed. I woke the next morning feeling drained and unsettled. The events of the previous night played over in my mind, and I found myself unable to dismiss them as mere figments of my imagination. The whispers, the footprints, and the oppressive atmosphere were all too vivid to ignore. I decided to return to the cemetery, determined to uncover the truth behind the strange occurrences. Little did I know that my visit would lead me to a horrifying discovery, one that would unravel the very fabric of reality and plunge me into a nightmarish world where demons and the supernatural were all too real. The following evening, I found myself driving back to the cemetery, this time with a heightened sense of purpose. The events of the previous night had left me with more questions than answers, and I felt an uneasy mixture of dread and curiosity. I had resolved to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing whatever was lurking in the shadows. As I parked my car once again near the wrought iron gates, I took a deep breath and steeled myself. The cemetery looked the same as it did the night before, but the familiar surroundings felt more menacing in the dim light. I grabbed a small flashlight, a digital camera, and a notebook, my tools for documenting any findings. I began by retracing my steps from the previous night, focusing on the peculiar tombstone of Emily Thompson. As I approached, I noticed the ivy had grown thicker since my last visit, almost as if it was trying to conceal the grave further. The inscription was barely readable, but I could still make out the name and the dates. My flashlight beam danced over the tombstone, casting eerie shadows across the weathered stone. The feeling of coldness was more pronounced now, and I could sense an almost tangible heaviness in the air. I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. It was clear that whatever I had experienced the previous night was not a fluke. I began to document the surroundings, taking photographs of the grave and the area nearby. The camera's flash illuminated the scene briefly, but it did little to dispel the darkness. The whispers from last night seemed to linger in the corners of my mind, echoing with a haunting persistence. As I examined the photographs, I noticed something strange. In one of the images, just behind the tombstone, there appeared to be a shadowy figure. It was indistinct and blurred, but the outline was unmistakable. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of the light or an optical illusion, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. Determined to make sense of it, I continued my investigation. I walked along the pathways, inspecting other graves and taking more photographs. The cemetery seemed unusually silent, the rustling of leaves replaced by an eerie stillness. Every now and then, I thought I saw fleeting movements out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As I reached the edge of the cemetery, I noticed an old, decaying mausoleum that I hadn't seen before. Its door was slightly ajar, and the sight of it filled me with a sense of foreboding. I approached cautiously, my flashlight revealing a dark interior filled with cobwebs and dust. Inside, the mausoleum was eerily quiet. I scanned the walls, which were lined with faded inscriptions and forgotten mementos. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed a peculiar object resting on a small pedestal, a weathered, ornate box with intricate carvings. I hesitated before approaching the box, my hands trembling as I reached out to open it. The lid creaked open, revealing a collection of old photographs and documents. Among them was a letter, its edges yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully, my eyes scanning the faded ink. The letter was a desperate plea from someone named Abigail. She wrote about strange occurrences and a sense of being watched. Her words spoke of a growing darkness that seemed to envelop the cemetery, and she begged for help in putting the restless spirits to rest. The letter was dated from the early 20th century, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Abigail's fears were somehow connected to what I had experienced. I took the letter and the photographs, deciding that they might hold the key to understanding the cemetery's disturbing history. As I made my way back to the entrance, the shadows seemed to deepen, and the whispers returned, more insistent this time. They seemed to be calling out, growing louder and more frantic. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a sudden rustling behind me. I spun around, but once again, there was nothing there. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I hurried to my car, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had uncovered. Back home, I spread out the photographs and documents on my desk, hoping to find some clue that would explain the strange events at the cemetery. The letter from Abigail was particularly troubling, and I wondered if there was a way to find out more about her and the history of the cemetery. As I delved into my research, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers seemed to follow me, echoing in the silence of my home. It was as if the spirits of the cemetery had found a way to reach beyond its boundaries, and the oppressive sense of dread was inescapable. The more I studied the documents, the more I became convinced that there was a malevolent force at work. The cemetery was not merely a resting place for the dead, it was a gateway to something far more sinister. My investigation had only scratched the surface, and I knew that I had to return to the cemetery to uncover the full extent of the darkness that lay within. The following days were filled with restless nights and a constant sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that the whispers from the cemetery had followed me home. My research into Abigail and the cemetery's history provided little comfort, only deepening the mystery. I decided it was time to return to the cemetery, armed with the letter and photographs I had found. My goal was to explore further, hoping to uncover more clues about the strange occurrences and the unsettling history of the cemetery. On the night of my return, the air was thick with fog, adding an extra layer of eeriness to the already unsettling atmosphere. I parked my car near the entrance, the headlights barely penetrating the dense mist. As I walked towards the cemetery, I felt a familiar chill creep up my spine, a reminder of the fear that had gripped me during my last visit. I made my way to the mausoleum first, determined to investigate it further. The fog seemed to cling to the gravestones and the air felt damp and cold. The mausoleum stood as an imposing figure against the mist, its door still slightly ajar from my last visit. I approached cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, I was struck by the oppressive silence. The box I had found before was still on its pedestal, and I carefully examined its contents again. This time, I noticed a small, hidden compartment within the box, which I had missed previously. With a bit of effort, I managed to open it, revealing a set of old keys and a small leather-bound journal. The journal was worn but still intact. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart racing as I read through its pages. The entries were written in a scrawling hand and spoke of rituals and dark ceremonies performed at the cemetery. The author, who identified themselves as a member of a secret society, described how they had been performing rituals to summon and bind restless spirits. The journal detailed various rites performed under the cover of darkness, intended to keep the spirits bound and prevent them from causing harm. The last entry was particularly disturbing. It mentioned a ritual that was performed to open a portal to another realm, a place where demons resided. The author claimed that the ritual had been successful, but they feared that they had unleashed something far beyond their control. As I read the journal, a sense of dread grew within me. The idea that the cemetery might be a gateway to a realm of demons was both horrifying and intriguing. I realized that the whispers I had heard and the strange occurrences might be related to this dark ritual. I decided to explore the cemetery further, hoping to find more evidence that would shed light on the ritual described in the journal. As I wandered through the fog-shrouded grounds, I noticed that the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, as if the fog itself was alive and pressing in on me. I made my way to a secluded part of the cemetery, where the gravestones were older and more weathered. Here, the fog was thickest, and the sense of unease was almost palpable. I shone my flashlight around, trying to pierce through the dense fog, when I noticed something unusual, a series of markings on the ground, arranged in a circular pattern. The markings were crude but unmistakable. They resembled symbols and runes that I had seen in the journal, and they seemed to form a ritualistic circle. My heart pounded as I realized that this might be the site where the dark rituals had been performed. I could feel the temperature drop even further, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. As I stepped into the circle, a sudden rush of cold air surrounded me. The fog seemed to part momentarily, revealing a figure standing in the distance. It was a shadowy silhouette, its features obscured by the darkness. I froze, my breath visible in the frigid air. The figure remained motionless, but I could sense an intense malevolence emanating from it. My flashlight flickered erratically, and the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were coming from the figure itself. I felt a sense of impending doom, as if something terrible was about to happen. I tried to back away, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The figure began to move slowly towards me, its shadow stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. I could hear a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very ground beneath me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled out of the circle, my flashlight casting erratic beams as I fled towards the cemetery entrance. The fog seemed to close in around me, the whispers growing more frenzied. My heart raced, and I could barely see where I was going. As I reached the entrance, I glanced back one last time, but the figure was gone. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cemetery was shrouded in an oppressive darkness. I hurried to my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The drive home was a blur of fear and adrenaline. The events of the night replayed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been unleashed, something that I had only begun to understand. Back at home, I locked the doors and sat down with the journal and photographs. The rituals described in the journal were disturbing, and I couldn't help but feel that my actions had played a part in awakening something malevolent. The whispers, the figure, and the ritualistic markings all pointed to a dark force that was now active and seeking something, perhaps revenge, perhaps something far worse. As I reviewed my notes and photographs, I realized that I needed to learn more about the history of the cemetery and the secret society that had performed the rituals. The answers were out there, and I was determined to find them, no matter how dangerous the journey might be. The unease I felt after my last visit to the cemetery only deepened over the following days. The whispers had become a constant presence, drifting through my thoughts and causing me sleepless nights. The figure I had seen, or imagined, was a persistent shadow on my mind. I knew I needed to uncover more about the cemetery's dark history and the secret society described in the journal. My research led me to the local library, where I scoured old records and newspapers for any mention of the cemetery and the secret society. I hoped that historical documents might shed light on the mysterious events and provide answers about the rituals described in the journal. After hours of sifting through musty records and yellowed newspapers, I found a series of articles about strange occurrences in the cemetery over the past century. The reports mentioned sightings of ghostly figures, unexplained noises, and unusual activities. They also spoke of an enigmatic group known as the Keepers of the Veil, a secret society rumored to have performed dark rituals to control and contain restless spirits. The more I read, the more I became convinced that the society had been involved in a complex and dangerous ritualistic system. The articles hinted that their practices had led to unintended consequences, including the release of dark forces that had plagued the cemetery for decades. Among the articles, I found a particularly intriguing piece about a fire that had ravaged the cemetery's caretaker's house in the early 1900s. The fire had been attributed to an accidental cause, but local legends suggested otherwise. It was said that the caretaker had been involved in the rituals of the Keepers of the Veil and had accidentally unleashed a demonic presence that had never truly been contained. Determined to find more concrete evidence, I returned to the cemetery, armed with the information I had gathered. I felt a growing sense of dread as I approached the wrought iron gates once more. The fog was still present, clinging to the ground like a living entity. I parked my car and walked towards the mausoleum, where I planned to investigate further. As I entered the mausoleum, the oppressive silence was even more pronounced. I had taken the photographs and documents from the journal with me, hoping they might provide additional context or clues. I revisited the ornate box and the hidden compartment, re-examining the contents for anything I might have missed. My flashlight beam fell upon an old, tattered map tucked away in the box. It was a hand-drawn map of the cemetery, marked with various symbols and annotations. The map appeared to show different locations where the rituals had been performed, including the site of the ritualistic circle I had discovered earlier. I followed the map's indications, leading me to a secluded part of the cemetery that I had not yet explored. The fog was thick and disorienting, but I pressed on, guided by the map and the faint whispers that seemed to echo from the shadows. The map led me to a hidden crypt, partially buried and obscured by overgrown vegetation. I cleared away the debris and found a heavy iron door. With some effort, I managed to pry it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. As I descended the staircase, the air grew colder and the whispers became louder. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, and I could feel a palpable sense of dread. The staircase ended in a dimly lit chamber, its walls lined with ancient symbols and arcane markings. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. The markings on the altar matched those on the map and the journal, confirming that this was a significant site for the rituals. I approached the altar cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the symbols etched into the stone. On the altar, I found a collection of old relics, candles, a ceremonial dagger, and various ritualistic objects. They were arranged in a manner consistent with the descriptions in the journal. My heart pounded as I realized the gravity of what had been done here. This was the heart of the rituals, the place where the dark forces had been summoned and bound. As I examined the relics, I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped even further, and the whispers grew more frantic. I looked around, and to my horror, I saw shadows moving on the walls, taking on grotesque and menacing forms. The air seemed to crackle with malevolent energy. A figure appeared at the edge of my flashlight's beam, a shadowy presence that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Its form was indistinct, but it exuded a palpable sense of evil. I could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating, and I knew that I had awakened something that should have remained undisturbed. Panic surged through me, and I turned to flee, but the shadows seemed to close in around me. The chamber felt like it was collapsing, the walls pulsating with a dark energy. I stumbled up the staircase, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fought to escape the malevolent force that seemed to be pursuing me. Emerging from the crypt, I rushed through the cemetery, the fog swirling around me like a living entity. The whispers were now a cacophony of voices, growing louder and more chaotic. I reached the entrance, my car in sight, and I hurriedly got inside, my hand shaking as I started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. The cemetery receded into the fog behind me, and the whispers faded to a distant murmur. I knew that I had barely escaped the clutches of whatever had been awakened, and the sense of dread would stay with me for a long time. Back at home, I locked all the doors and took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding of my heart. The documents and relics I had found were a stark reminder of the dark forces that had been unleashed. I realized that the cemetery was no longer just a place of rest, it was a gateway to something far more sinister. The journey had left me changed, and I knew that I could never truly escape the darkness that had been awakened. The cemetery of demons was no longer a distant place, it was a part of me, a haunting presence that would linger long after I had left. The cursed painting. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you were completely alone? My name is Sam, and I never believed in the supernatural. I was a skeptic, always dismissing stories of haunted houses and cursed objects as nothing more than fanciful tales. But all of that changed when I inherited a painting from my late grandmother. It was a portrait of an old man with piercing eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. What started as a curiosity soon turned into a nightmare. I had never spent much time in my grandmother's old house. It was a large, creaky Victorian with a labyrinth of rooms and hallways that always seemed to be shrouded in shadows. After her passing, I decided to sort through her belongings, mainly out of obligation rather than sentimentality. The house was filled with relics from a bygone era, but one item stood out above all the rest, the painting. The painting depicted a man with an austere expression. His clothing was from a century ago, and his eyes were unsettlingly lifelike. I remember feeling a shiver run down my spine the first time I saw it. Despite my reservations, I decided to hang it in my living room. I rationalized it as a way to preserve my grandmother's memory, not fully understanding what I was inviting into my life. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice peculiar things happening around the house. At first, it was just small annoyances. I would misplace keys or forget where I put things. I thought it was simply the stress of dealing with my grandmother's estate. But then, things took a more disturbing turn. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard a soft thud from the direction of the painting. I glanced up, but the room was still and silent. I brushed it off as the house settling, though it seemed odd since the sound was much louder than usual. The following night, I was awakened by a chilling breeze despite all the windows being closed. I thought perhaps I had left a door ajar, but when I checked, everything was locked tight. The most unsettling incident happened when I was alone in the house one rainy afternoon. The power had gone out, and the only light came from the dim glow of candles scattered around. I was attempting to read by candlelight when I noticed something strange. The eyes of the man in the painting seemed to move. They followed me as I shifted in my seat. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation of being watched was too intense to ignore. A few days later, I decided to research the painting's origins, hoping to find some rational explanation. I visited a local antique store and asked the owner, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Thompson, if he knew anything about it. He scrutinized the painting closely, his expression growing more serious as he examined it. "This is a peculiar piece," he finally said. "Do you know where it came from?" I told him it had been in my grandmother's house for as long as I could remember. Mr. Thompson's face turned pale as he spoke. "There have been stories about paintings like this," he said, lowering his voice. "They say that some artists can capture more than just a likeness. Sometimes they can capture something else, something that can come to life." I dismissed his words as mere superstition, but a seed of doubt had been planted in my mind. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was somehow affecting me. I found myself unable to sleep, staring at the man's eyes as they seemed to glow eerily in the dim light of my living room. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances intensified. Objects began to move on their own, and strange noises filled the house at night. I started to feel a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. It was as if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. Then came the night when everything changed. I was sitting at my desk, working late into the night, when I heard a loud crash from the living room. Heart pounding, I rushed to see what had happened. The painting was on the floor, the frame shattered, but the portrait was intact. The old man's eyes seemed more intense than ever, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I decided it was time to get rid of the painting. I wrapped it up and took it to the local thrift store, hoping to put the whole ordeal behind me. But the very next day, the painting was back on my living room wall, as if it had never left. The final straw came when I noticed something written on the back of the painting that I had never seen before. In faded, scrawling letters were the words, "He watches. He waits." The cursed painting. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you were completely alone? My name is Sam, and I never believed in the supernatural. I was a skeptic, always dismissing stories of haunted houses and cursed objects as nothing more than fanciful tales. But all of that changed when I inherited a painting from my late grandmother. It was a portrait of an old man with piercing eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. What started as a curiosity soon turned into a nightmare. I had never spent much time in my grandmother's old house. It was a large, creaky Victorian with a labyrinth of rooms and hallways that always seemed to be shrouded in shadows. After her passing, I decided to sort through her belongings, mainly out of obligation rather than sentimentality. The house was filled with relics from a bygone era, but one item stood out above all the rest, the painting. The painting depicted a man with an austere expression. His clothing was from a century ago, and his eyes were unsettlingly lifelike. I remember feeling a shiver run down my spine the first time I saw it. Despite my reservations, I decided to hang it in my living room. I rationalized it as a way to preserve my grandmother's memory, not fully understanding what I was inviting into my life. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice peculiar things happening around the house. At first, it was just small annoyances. I would misplace keys or forget where I put things. I thought it was simply the stress of dealing with my grandmother's estate. But then, things took a more disturbing turn. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard a soft thud from the direction of the painting. I glanced up, but the room was still and silent. I brushed it off as the house settling, though it seemed odd since the sound was much louder than usual. The following night, I was awakened by a chilling breeze despite all the windows being closed. I thought perhaps I had left a door ajar, but when I checked, everything was locked tight. The most unsettling incident happened when I was alone in the house one rainy afternoon. The power had gone out, and the only light came from the dim glow of candles scattered around. I was attempting to read by candlelight when I noticed something strange. The eyes of the man in the painting seemed to move. They followed me as I shifted in my seat. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation of being watched was too intense to ignore. A few days later, I decided to research the painting's origins, hoping to find some rational explanation. I visited a local antique store and asked the owner, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Thompson, if he knew anything about it. He scrutinized the painting closely, his expression growing more serious as he examined it. "This is a peculiar piece," he finally said. "Do you know where it came from?" I told him it had been in my grandmother's house for as long as I could remember. Mr. Thompson's face turned pale as he spoke. "There have been stories about paintings like this," he said, lowering his voice. "They say that some artists can capture more than just a likeness. Sometimes they can capture something else, something that can come to life." I dismissed his words as mere superstition, but a seed of doubt had been planted in my mind. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was somehow affecting me. I found myself unable to sleep, staring at the man's eyes as they seemed to glow eerily in the dim light of my living room. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances intensified. Objects began to move on their own, and strange noises filled the house at night. I started to feel a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. It was as if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. Then came the night when everything changed. I was sitting at my desk, working late into the night, when I heard a loud crash from the living room. Heart pounding, I rushed to see what had happened. The painting was on the floor, the frame shattered, but the portrait was intact. The old man's eyes seemed more intense than ever, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I decided it was time to get rid of the painting. I wrapped it up and took it to the local thrift store, hoping to put the whole ordeal behind me. But the very next day, the painting was back on my living room wall, as if it had never left. The final straw came when I noticed something written on the back of the painting that I had never seen before. In faded, scrawling letters were the words, "He watches. He waits." In the days that followed, the disturbances continued to escalate. Objects would fall off shelves without explanation, and strange noises filled the house at night. I began to feel like a prisoner in my own home. I knew I had to find a way to end the torment, but I was running out of options. I decided to contact a local historian who specialized in occult artifacts. I hoped that their expertise could shed light on the painting and provide a solution. When I met with the historian, Dr. Helen Carter, she listened intently to my story. She seemed genuinely intrigued and agreed to help me investigate the painting's origins and its connection to Sinclair. Dr. Carter suggested that we perform a thorough examination of the painting and its surroundings to uncover any hidden clues or symbols. She also recommended researching any past rituals or practices associated with the painting. It was clear that the painting held a dark secret, and I was determined to uncover it before it drove me to the brink of insanity. Dr. Ellen Carter and I met in her office, a cluttered room filled with old books and curious artifacts. She was a tall woman with sharp features, and her demeanor was both professional and intense. I presented the painting to her, and she examined it with a keen eye. "This is indeed a troubling piece," she said, her brow furrowing as she studied the portrait. "There are several signs that suggest it may be more than just a painting. It's possible that this piece was involved in some form of ritual or occult practice." She began by carefully inspecting the painting's frame and backing. With her specialized tools, she looked for hidden symbols or inscriptions that could provide clues about its history. I watched, anxious and hopeful, as she worked. "There's something strange here," Dr. Carter finally said, pointing to a series of small, barely visible markings on the back of the canvas. These could be remnants of a ritualistic script. It's difficult to say for certain without a more detailed analysis, but it's clear that this painting was treated with a certain reverence or fear. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. The idea that the painting had been involved in something dark and ritualistic made my blood run cold. I asked her what we could do to break the curse, if there was one. "There are a few methods we could try," Dr. Carter explained. "First, we need to understand the nature of the curse. Sometimes, these paintings can trap spirits or energies that are bound to the artwork. If that's the case, we might need to perform a cleansing ritual to remove the influence. However, we need to be cautious. Performing rituals without understanding the full context can sometimes make things worse." Dr. Carter suggested that we start by researching any historical or ritualistic practices that might be connected to the painting. We spent the following days poring over ancient texts and historical records, trying to find any link between Edward Sinclair and occult practices. We found a few references to occult groups operating in the late 19th century, but nothing concrete linking Sinclair directly to these practices. The more we uncovered, the more it became clear that the painting was deeply intertwined with something malevolent. The reports of previous owners' misfortunes seemed to follow a pattern. Each person experienced increasing paranoia, vivid nightmares, and an overwhelming sense of dread before eventually abandoning the painting. One night, as I was researching alone, I heard a noise from the living room. It sounded like a faint scratching, almost as if something was trying to get out. I approached cautiously, but found nothing unusual. The painting was hanging on the wall, seemingly as calm and innocent as ever. Yet, the sense of unease persisted. I decided to move the painting to a different room, hoping that it might alleviate some of the disturbances. I carefully wrapped it and carried it to the basement, a space that had been largely in use since my grandmother's passing. As I placed it down on an old, dusty table, I felt a chill run through me. The basement was dark and musty, and the air seemed to thicken with an almost tangible presence. As I turned to leave, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but the basement door was still open. I could hear the faintest whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. The darkness seemed to close in, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, sending me into a panicked flight up the stairs. I bolted back to the safety of my living room, where I found the painting had somehow made its way back to its original place on the wall. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stared at the painting, feeling as though it was mocking my attempts to escape its influence. Dr. Carter and I decided to perform a cleansing ritual. We planned to do it in the basement, where the painting had seemed to be most active. We gathered a few necessary items: candles, salt, and various herbs. The basement was set up as a makeshift ritual space, with the painting at the center. The ritual began with Dr. Carter reciting incantations and burning the herbs to cleanse the space. I followed her instructions, placing salt around the perimeter of the area. The atmosphere was tense, and the air was thick with an otherworldly energy. As Dr. Carter continued with the ritual, I felt an intense pressure in my chest, as if the very air was pushing down on me. Halfway through the ritual, the temperature dropped suddenly. The candles flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. I could hear the whispers again, louder and more insistent. The shadows seemed to coalesce around the painting, which now appeared to be glowing faintly. Dr. Carter's voice grew more urgent as she completed the incantations. Suddenly, the basement light flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I felt a surge of panic and tried to focus on the ritual, but the oppressive atmosphere made it difficult to concentrate. Just as we were about to complete the final steps, a loud crash echoed through the basement. The candles extinguished, and the room was plunged into pitch blackness. I could hear Dr. Carter's muffled voice, but the fear and confusion made it hard to understand her. The whispers grew louder, almost as if they were screaming in my ears. Suddenly, the light came back on, and the basement was illuminated once more. The painting was now lying on the floor, its frame shattered. The whispers had ceased, and the oppressive feeling had lifted somewhat. Dr. Carter looked exhausted but relieved. "That was more intense than I expected," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "It's clear that the painting has a powerful influence. We've managed to break some of its hold, but I'm not sure if the curse is entirely lifted." I was both relieved and troubled by her words. The ritual had provided some respite, but the painting's power was not entirely gone. I knew I had to remain vigilant and continue to search for answers. The following days were quieter, but the sense of unease lingered. I continued to research, hoping to find a more permanent solution. Dr. Carter suggested reaching out to other experts who might have encountered similar cases. I was determined to end this nightmare once and for all, but I knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. As I sat in my living room, trying to focus on my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was still watching me. The eyes of the old man seemed to follow me wherever I went, and the whispers occasionally returned in the dead of night. It was clear that the painting's influence was far from over, and I had to prepare for whatever was coming next. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and relentless research. Dr. Carter's ritual had offered a brief respite, but the painting's malevolent presence seemed to linger, almost as if it were lying in wait. The unsettling whispers continued to haunt me, and the shadows in my home seemed to take on a life of their own. One evening, as I was sifting through old documents in my study, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Carter. Her voice was tinged with urgency. "I think I've found something," she said. "I came across an old journal that might shed light on the origins of the painting. It belonged to a researcher who studied occult artifacts, and it contains detailed notes on similar cases." I rushed to Dr. Carter's office, eager to learn more. When I arrived, she was already poring over the journal. Her eyes were wide with excitement and concern. "This journal is a goldmine," she said. "It describes a phenomenon known as soul imprinting. According to the researcher, some objects, especially those created with dark intent, can trap and reflect the essence of a person. In some cases, these objects can even cause harm to those who come into contact with them. The researchers' notes detailed various methods for dealing with such artifacts, including rituals and protective measures. One method stood out, a purification ceremony that involved confronting the entity trapped within the object and forcing it to leave. The process was complex and dangerous, but it seemed to offer the best chance of breaking the painting's hold. Dr. Carter and I decided to perform the purification ceremony. We gathered the necessary materials: candles, incense, sacred texts, and protective symbols. The ceremony was set to take place in the basement, where the painting had been most active. The night of the ceremony, we prepared the basement carefully, arranging the items in a specific pattern and setting up a protective circle around the painting. The atmosphere was tense as we began the ritual. Dr. Carter recited ancient incantations while I followed her lead, lighting candles and placing the symbols around the room. As we proceeded, the temperature in the basement dropped sharply. The candles flickered and cast eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers began again, louder and more insistent. I could feel a palpable sense of anger and resistance emanating from the painting. The ceremony reached its climax as Dr. Carter and I confronted the entity. She spoke directly to it, demanding that it reveal itself and leave the painting. The room was filled with a chilling presence, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist in response to her words. Suddenly, the painting began to shake violently, and a dark mist seemed to seep from its surface. The whispers grew into a cacophony of screams and distorted voices. I felt a surge of terror, but I forced myself to stay focused on the ritual. With a final incantation, Dr. Carter commanded the entity to depart. The mist began to dissipate, and the painting fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. Exhausted but hopeful, we concluded the ceremony. The painting was now eerily still, its surface calm and untroubled. We carefully wrapped it and placed it in a sealed container, intending to store it in a secure location where it could do no further harm. As I left Dr. Carter's office, I felt a cautious sense of relief. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, but I knew that the painting's influence might still linger in some form. I decided to take the painting to a secure storage facility where it could be kept away from anyone who might be affected by it. The following weeks were filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The whispers had stopped, and the shadows in my home no longer seemed to move on their own. Life began to return to a semblance of normalcy, but I remained vigilant, aware that the painting's curse might still have lingering effects. One night, as I was preparing for bed, I received a call from Dr. Carter. Her voice was filled with a mix of excitement and caution. "I've been doing more research," she said. "There's a chance that the painting might have left a mark on you, even if the immediate curse has been lifted. I suggest you keep a journal of any unusual experiences or feelings you have." I took her advice to heart and began keeping a detailed journal. I noted down any odd occurrences, dreams, or feelings of unease. The entries gradually became less frequent, and I hoped that the curse had been fully broken. As time passed, the painting became a distant memory. The experiences I had with it seemed almost surreal, like a vivid nightmare. Yet, I could not completely shake the feeling that the painting had changed something within me. I continued to live cautiously, always on the lookout for any signs of its lingering influence. In the end, the painting was a powerful reminder of the unknown forces that can exist in the world. It was a testament to the darkness that can be hidden within something seemingly innocuous, and the lengths we must go to confront and overcome it. Though the immediate threat had passed, the experience left a lasting impact on me. I had faced a dark force and emerged victorious, but I knew that the world was filled with mysteries and dangers that were often beyond our understanding. And as I looked back on the ordeal, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly escaped the curse, or was there still a shadow of it lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to return? Nightmares. Have you ever woken up in the dead of night, your heart racing, drenched in sweat, with the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching you? I thought it was just a bad dream until I discovered that my nightmares weren't just confined to sleep. It all began on an ordinary Tuesday. I was finishing up some work late in the evening. The kind of work that you don't really think twice about when you're in the flow, just typing away, the hum of the computer, and the occasional sip from a now cold cup of coffee. That evening, the city outside my window was unusually quiet, as if the entire world had paused. The silence was eerie, but not enough to make me feel uneasy. I was used to working late, it was part of my routine. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but I had an inexplicable sense of foreboding. When I finally decided to turn in, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere had thickened. My bedroom was a sanctuary, or at least it was supposed to be, a place of rest and solace. I closed the blinds tightly, ensuring that no streetlights seeped through, and nestled under the covers. That's when it started. The first night, it was just a fleeting sense of unease. I woke up several times, heart pounding, convinced that I heard a whispering sound, a distant murmur that vanished whenever I tried to locate it. I dismissed it as the stress of a work week. But as the days passed, the nightmares grew more intense. I would dream of shadowy figures standing at the foot of my bed, their eyes glowing red, their presence malevolent and unsettling. I'd wake up in terror, only to find the room bathed in the same oppressive darkness, with no sign of any intruder. One night, I saw it clearly, an entity with a face twisted in anguish, its eyes hollow voids. It reached out with skeletal hands, and though I tried to scream, no sound came out. I woke up in my bed, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. It was as if the dream had seeped into reality. The next day, I called in sick to work. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. My friend, Rachel, came over to check on me. She was concerned, having heard me mention my disturbed sleep and the bizarre nightmares. She suggested that I might be suffering from stress or sleep deprivation. That night, Rachel stayed over. She brought some lavender oil and a calming playlist, insisting that it would help me relax. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Rachel's presence made me feel slightly better, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the nightmare returned. I was dreaming again, and this time the figure was even clearer. It was standing in the corner of my room, its eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I tried to call out to Rachel, but she was nowhere to be found. I struggled to wake up, my body paralyzed as the entity drew closer. When I did finally wake, Rachel was still beside me, but she was asleep, her face serene. I didn't want to wake her, so I lay there in the darkness, trying to calm my racing heart. The room felt colder than usual, and I noticed something unsettling. The lavender scent from earlier seemed to have vanished, replaced by an acrid, metallic odor. The nightmares continued, each night growing more vivid and terrifying. I started to fear falling asleep. My work began to suffer, and even during the day, I would find myself jumping at the slightest noise. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, not just in my dreams, but in my waking hours as well. Rachel suggested that I consult a therapist or even a paranormal expert. I was hesitant at first, but the persistent dread made me consider it seriously. I began researching the phenomena I was experiencing, hoping for answers. That's when I stumbled upon a chilling fact. There were stories of people who had experienced similar nightmares that seemed to cross the boundary between the dream world and reality. Intrigued and frightened, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Linda who specialized in entities that purportedly haunted the boundary between dreams and waking life. Linda agreed to meet with me, and during our first conversation, she revealed something that made my blood run cold. She spoke of a particular kind of entity, one that was known to invade the dreams of its victims, attempting to possess them through their deepest fears. It was a demon, not just in the sense of a malevolent spirit, but something far more insidious, a creature that preyed on the vulnerable. Linda offered to conduct a ritual to help cleanse my space and protect me from the entity. I was desperate for relief, so I agreed. She arrived at my apartment one evening, bringing with her an array of protective charms, incense, and other items necessary for the ritual. Nightmares. Have you ever woken up in the dead of night, your heart racing, drenched in sweat, with the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching you? I thought it was just a bad dream until I discovered that my nightmares weren't just confined to sleep. It all began on an ordinary Tuesday. I was finishing up some work late in the evening. The kind of work that you don't really think twice about when you're in the flow, just typing away, the hum of the computer, and the occasional sip from a now cold cup of coffee. That evening, the city outside my window was unusually quiet, as if the entire world had paused. The silence was eerie, but not enough to make me feel uneasy. I was used to working late, it was part of my routine. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but I had an inexplicable sense of foreboding. When I finally decided to turn in, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere had thickened. My bedroom was a sanctuary, or at least it was supposed to be, a place of rest and solace. I closed the blinds tightly, ensuring that no streetlights seeped through, and nestled under the covers. That's when it started. The first night, it was just a fleeting sense of unease. I woke up several times, heart pounding, convinced that I heard a whispering sound, a distant murmur that vanished whenever I tried to locate it. I dismissed it as the stress of a work week. But as the days passed, the nightmares grew more intense. I would dream of shadowy figures standing at the foot of my bed, their eyes glowing red, their presence malevolent and unsettling. I'd wake up in terror, only to find the room bathed in the same oppressive darkness, with no sign of any intruder. One night, I saw it clearly, an entity with a face twisted in anguish, its eyes hollow voids. It reached out with skeletal hands, and though I tried to scream, no sound came out. I woke up in my bed, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. It was as if the dream had seeped into reality. The next day, I called in sick to work. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. My friend, Rachel, came over to check on me. She was concerned, having heard me mention my disturbed sleep and the bizarre nightmares. She suggested that I might be suffering from stress or sleep deprivation. That night, Rachel stayed over. She brought some lavender oil and a calming playlist, insisting that it would help me relax. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Rachel's presence made me feel slightly better, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the nightmare returned. I was dreaming again, and this time the figure was even clearer. It was standing in the corner of my room, its eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I tried to call out to Rachel, but she was nowhere to be found. I struggled to wake up, my body paralyzed as the entity drew closer. When I did finally wake, Rachel was still beside me, but she was asleep, her face serene. I didn't want to wake her, so I lay there in the darkness, trying to calm my racing heart. The room felt colder than usual, and I noticed something unsettling. The lavender scent from earlier seemed to have vanished, replaced by an acrid, metallic odor. The nightmares continued, each night growing more vivid and terrifying. I started to fear falling asleep. My work began to suffer, and even during the day, I would find myself jumping at the slightest noise. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, not just in my dreams, but in my waking hours as well. Rachel suggested that I consult a therapist or even a paranormal expert. I was hesitant at first, but the persistent dread made me consider it seriously. I began researching the phenomena I was experiencing, hoping for answers. That's when I stumbled upon a chilling fact. There were stories of people who had experienced similar nightmares that seemed to cross the boundary between the dream world and reality. Intrigued and frightened, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Linda who specialized in entities that purportedly haunted the boundary between dreams and waking life. Linda agreed to meet with me, and during our first conversation, she revealed something that made my blood run cold. She spoke of a particular kind of entity, one that was known to invade the dreams of its victims, attempting to possess them through their deepest fears. It was a demon, not just in the sense of a malevolent spirit, but something far more insidious, a creature that preyed on the vulnerable. Linda offered to conduct a ritual to help cleanse my space and protect me from the entity. I was desperate for relief, so I agreed. She arrived at my apartment one evening, bringing with her an array of protective charms, incense, and other items necessary for the ritual. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I noticed the mirror glowing faintly in the darkness. It was as if a dim light emanated from within the cracked glass. The sight made my heart race, but I forced myself to close my eyes and try to sleep. The nightmare began as usual, with the shadowy figure approaching me with a malevolent intent. But this time, there was a difference. The figure seemed to materialize through the mirror, its eyes reflecting the same sinister glow that I had seen before. I felt a cold grip on my arm, and as I tried to wake up, I realized I was being pulled into the dream world, the boundary between reality and nightmare dissolving. When I finally awoke, I was drenched in sweat, my body trembling uncontrollably. The mirror was still on the shelf, its light now extinguished, but the sense of dread remained. I could no longer dismiss the idea that the mirror might be linked to the nightmares. Determined to find out more, I decided to research the mirror. I visited local antique shops and spoke with historians, trying to uncover any information about its origin. Most people I spoke to were unfamiliar with it, and the few who were couldn't provide any meaningful insight. It was as if the mirror had no history, as if it had simply appeared out of nowhere. One elderly woman, however, did share a chilling story. She spoke of a mirror that was said to be cursed, an artifact that could trap souls and blur the line between dreams and reality. According to her, such mirrors were believed to be conduits for malevolent entities seeking to cross over into our world. The woman's words haunted me. It seemed too coincidental that I had found such a mirror just as my nightmares escalated. The possibility that the mirror was a key to understanding or even controlling the entity made my skin crawl. With no other options, I sought the help of a local paranormal expert. This time, I contacted a man named Thomas who specialized in haunted objects. He agreed to come to my apartment and examine the mirror. Thomas arrived on a cold, rainy evening, his demeanor serious and focused. He brought with him an assortment of tools for detecting supernatural activity. As he inspected the mirror, he conducted a series of tests with his equipment. The readings were off the charts, indicating a strong presence of negative energy. Thomas's face grew pale as he conducted a more detailed examination, eventually finding an inscription on the back of the mirror that was partially obscured by years of tarnish. The inscription was in an old, almost illegible script. After translating it, Thomas revealed that it was a binding spell intended to trap and contain a demonic presence. The spell had evidently weakened over time, allowing the entity to escape into the mirror and, consequently, into my dreams. Thomas warned me that removing the mirror could potentially worsen the situation if not done correctly. He suggested a cleansing ritual, but the process was complex and required precise execution. I agreed, desperate to rid myself of the mirror and the entity that seemed to be growing more powerful by the day. As the ritual began, Thomas recited ancient incantations and used various tools to dispel the negative energy surrounding the mirror. I watched, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple and pulse as if it were alive. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, and I felt an oppressive weight pressing down on me. The ritual continued for hours, Thomas's chanting growing louder and more intense. The mirror's glow faded, and the room felt warmer, the chill that had pervaded my apartment lifting. When Thomas finally finished, he carefully wrapped the mirror and prepared to take it away. "Keep your doors locked and avoid looking into any reflective surfaces," he advised, his face grave. "The entity may try to reach you through other means." I was left alone with a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The mirror was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity might still be lurking somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The nightmares had eased slightly, but the sense of being watched persisted. I decided to take proactive steps to protect myself, including installing security cameras and improving the lighting in my apartment. I hoped these measures would help keep me safe from any lingering effects of the entity. As the days turned into weeks, the nightmares became less frequent, but I remained on edge. The terror that had once gripped me seemed to have receded, but I couldn't fully shake the feeling that the entity was still out there, just beyond the edge of my perception. One evening, while organizing some old papers, I stumbled upon a letter that I had forgotten about. It was from the previous tenant of my apartment, someone who had moved out abruptly a few months before I moved in. The letter was addressed to the landlord, explaining their sudden departure due to strange occurrences and unexplainable events. The details in the letter mirrored my own experiences, and it struck me with a chilling realization. It seemed that the entity might not have been confined to just the mirror. It could be tied to the apartment itself. This new discovery left me with a sense of dread, knowing that the problem might be more deeply rooted than I had initially thought. Have you ever felt like you're trapped in a place with a dark history that refuses to let you go? As if the walls around you hold secrets that are slowly consuming you? The letter from the previous tenant had left me shaken. It was clear that my apartment had a history that I hadn't fully understood before. The idea that the entity might be tied to the very place where I lived added a new layer of fear to my already fraught existence. I decided to dig deeper into the apartment's history, hoping to uncover more about what I was dealing with. I visited the local archives, poring over old records and news clippings related to the building. My search yielded some disturbing information. Several previous tenants have reported similar experiences, strange noises, inexplicable cold spots, and even sightings of shadowy figures. It seemed that the building had a pattern of unsettling occurrences that spanned decades. One article mentioned a fire that had occurred in the building many years ago. The fire had been devastating, resulting in several deaths and extensive damage. The reports indicated that the cause of the fire was never fully determined, and rumors of paranormal activity had circulated since then. It was as if the building itself was cursed, its history marked by tragedy and darkness. With this new information, I decided to contact a historian who specialized in local legends and haunted locations. Her name was Evelyn, and she had a reputation for uncovering the hidden truths behind supposedly cursed places. I hoped she could provide more insight into the history of the building and its possible connection to the entity. Evelyn agreed to meet with me, and we arranged a time for her to visit my apartment. She arrived with a collection of old maps, photographs, and historical documents. As she examined the materials, she seemed increasingly intrigued by the details I had shared about my experiences. She began her investigation by exploring the building's history, including any unusual events or individuals associated with it. Evelyn's research revealed that the building had once been the site of a secretive religious cult known for its dark rituals and occult practices. The cult had been disbanded under mysterious circumstances, but rumors persisted about its dark influence. Evelyn shared her findings with me, describing the cult's activities in chilling detail. They have reportedly performed rituals designed to summon and control demonic entities. The connection between the cult and the entity tormenting me seemed too significant to ignore. The revelation was both terrifying and enlightening. It explained why my experiences had felt so intense and personal. The entity wasn't just a random spirit, it was connected to a darker, more malevolent force that had once been active in the very place where I lived. Evelyn suggested a comprehensive cleansing of the apartment to break any lingering ties to the entity. She recommended a team of experts who specialized in exorcisms and spiritual cleansings. Though skeptical about the effectiveness, I agreed to proceed, desperate for any solution that might alleviate my suffering. The cleansing ritual was an elaborate process involving prayers, chants, and the use of sacred objects. The team arrived with an assortment of tools and artifacts designed to drive away malevolent entities. The ritual took place over several hours, during which the apartment was filled with the sounds of chanting and the burning of incense. As the ritual progressed, I noticed that the atmosphere in the apartment changed. The oppressive weight that had been hanging over me seemed to lift, and the cold spots that had plagued the apartment began to dissipate. The team assured me that the entity was being driven out and that the apartment would be cleansed of its negative energy. Despite the temporary relief, I remained cautious. I continued to experience occasional moments of unease, but the intensity of the nightmares had diminished. I took additional precautions, including installing a more advanced security system and avoiding any reflective surfaces that might invite unwanted attention. One night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something unusual. A faint light was emanating from the closet, which I had not opened in weeks. The light flickered like a dying flame, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the closet to investigate. Inside, I found an old trunk that I had never seen before. It was dusty and worn, with intricate carvings on its surface. I hesitated but decided to open it, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. Inside the trunk were various items, old books, faded photographs, and strange artifacts. Among them was a journal with a leather cover, its pages yellowed with age. I carefully opened the journal, my heart pounding with anticipation. The entries were written in a spidery script, detailing the activities of the cult that had once occupied the building. The journal described rituals, incantations, and encounters with entities from other realms. It was clear that the previous occupants had been deeply involved in practices designed to summon and control supernatural forces. One entry caught my eye, describing a ritual intended to bind a powerful entity to a specific location. The ritual involved creating a binding circle and reciting incantations to trap the entity within a physical object. The journal mentioned a mirror as a potential vessel for this purpose, and I realized with a jolt that it might be the same mirror I had found. The revelation was both horrifying and enlightening. It seemed that the entity had been bound to the mirror as part of the cult's dark practices, and the mirror had found its way into my possession. The nightmare I had been experiencing was a direct result of the entity's efforts to break free from its confinement. Armed with this new knowledge, I contacted Evelyn and shared my findings. She was shocked by the connection and agreed to help me interpret the journal's details. We devised a plan to further cleanse the apartment and neutralize the entity's influence. Evelyn suggested performing a counter-ritual to break the binding spell and ensure that the entity could no longer exert its influence. The ritual would involve creating a new binding circle, reciting specific incantations, and using protective symbols to seal the entity's power. It was a complex and risky procedure, but it was our best chance of ending the torment once and for all. The night of the counter-ritual arrived, and I prepared myself for the intense experience. The apartment was filled with a sense of anticipation and tension as Evelyn and her team conducted the ritual. The atmosphere was charged with energy, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. As the ritual progressed, I felt a growing sense of unease. The entity seemed to resist the counter-ritual, its presence felt as a chilling wind that swept through the apartment. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered ominously. Despite the fear, I remained hopeful that the ritual would succeed. When the ritual was complete, the apartment felt different. The oppressive weight that had hung over me for so long was lifted, and the air seemed to clear. Evelyn and her team assured me that the entity had been successfully bound and that the apartment was now cleansed of its dark influence. The following days were a welcome respite from the nightmares and the constant sense of dread. The apartment felt lighter and more peaceful, and I slowly began to regain my sense of normalcy. The fear that had dominated my life for so long started to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still amiss. The entity's presence had been bound, but I was left with a lingering sense of unease. The experience had changed me, and I was constantly on guard, aware of the thin veil that separated the world I knew from the darkness that had once consumed me. One evening, while reflecting on my experiences, I received an unexpected phone call. It was a former tenant of the building who had recently moved back to town and wanted to meet with me. They had heard about the troubles I had faced and wanted to share their own story. The meeting was set for the following day, and I was filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What new revelations awaited me? Was there more to the building's history that I had yet to uncover? What if the true nature of your fears is more profound than you ever imagined? What if the darkness you fought against holds secrets that could alter your understanding of reality? The meeting with the former tenant was both a relief and a source of deep anxiety. The person, whose name was Mark, agreed to meet me at a local cafe. I arrived early, my mind racing with questions and fears. As I waited, I couldn't help but wonder what Mark might reveal about the building's history and whether it would bring new insights or only deepen my dread. Mark arrived looking tired but determined. He sat down across from me, his face etched with lines of worry and fatigue. After exchanging pleasantries, I explained my experiences and the recent events related to the entity and the mirror. Mark listened intently, nodding at various points. "I'm glad you reached out," Mark said finally. "I've been wanting to talk to someone about what happened to me. It's a story that's haunted me ever since I left the apartment." He took a deep breath and began recounting his own experiences. Mark had lived in the building a few years before me. At first, everything seemed normal, but as time went on, he began experiencing disturbing events. His stories mirrored my own: strange noises, cold spots, and unsettling dreams. Mark revealed that he had also found an old trunk in the apartment, similar to the one I had discovered. Inside, he had found a collection of occult books and artifacts, including a journal that seemed to document the activities of the cult. His experiences with the entity had been terrifying, involving violent dreams and unexplained phenomena that left him shaken and desperate to leave. The most disturbing thing, Mark said, his voice trembling, was that after I left the apartment, the nightmares didn't stop. I thought I had escaped, but they followed me. It was as if the entity was somehow connected to me, not just the apartment. This revelation sent a chill down my spine. If the entity had the ability to follow its victims, then my sense of security might be an illusion. Mark continued, explaining that he had eventually sought help from a different paranormal expert who had conducted a similar ritual but had been unable to fully resolve the issue. As we spoke, I couldn't ignore the sense of déjà vu. Mark's experiences seemed to mirror my own in unsettling ways. It was as if our stories were intertwined by something far more sinister than a mere coincidence. I'm convinced, Mark said, that there's something more to this. The building itself might be a focal point for these entities. It's not just the mirror, it's the place. Mark's words echoed Evelyn's earlier findings, but they added a new layer of complexity. If the building was indeed a focal point, then no matter how many rituals or cleansings were performed, the dark influence might persist. Determined to uncover more, I decided to visit the building's archives with Mark. We hoped that a deeper investigation might reveal additional clues about the building's history and its connection to the supernatural occurrences. The archives were filled with old records, blueprints, and news articles. As we sifted through the documents, we discovered more about the building's past. The records revealed that the building had been constructed on the site of an old cemetery, which had been moved to make way for the new construction. The cemetery's relocation had been controversial, with many locals opposing the move. Some believed that the spirits of those buried there had never been properly laid to rest, and that their unrest might have contributed to the building's dark reputation. The connection between the cemetery and the building's haunting history was becoming clearer. We also found records of a series of unexplained disappearances and deaths that had occurred in the building over the years. These incidents seemed to align with the timeline of the cult's activities and the construction of the building. It was as if the building had been cursed from the very beginning, its dark energy feeding off the spirits disturbed by the cemetery's relocation. As the investigation continued, I began to feel a growing sense of urgency. The entities seemed to be a manifestation of the building's cursed history, and no amount of cleansing or ritual might fully resolve the issue. The building itself was a vessel for dark forces, and the key to ending the torment might lie in confronting the source of the curse. With this in mind, Mark and I decided to take drastic action. We contacted a historian who specialized in the supernatural and arranged for a thorough examination of the building's history and its connection to the cemetery. The historian agreed to help us, bringing with her a team of experts in historical and paranormal research. The historian's findings were both fascinating and terrifying. She confirmed that the cemetery had been a significant site of spiritual unrest, and that the building's construction had been a major disturbance to the spirits. The dark energy that had accumulated over the years had created a powerful focal point for malevolent entities. Armed with this new information, we devised a plan to address the building's curse. The plan involved a multifaceted approach, a historical cleansing of the land, a ritual to appease the disturbed spirits, and a final sealing to prevent further supernatural activity. The cleansing ritual was conducted over several days, involving a combination of traditional rites and modern methods. The process was intense and emotionally draining, as it required not only the physical cleansing of the space but also a deep spiritual connection to the land's history and the spirits disturbed by its development. As the ritual concluded, I felt a profound sense of closure. The building's dark influence seemed to dissipate, and the nightmares and strange occurrences gradually faded. The sense of being watched and the oppressive atmosphere that had once dominated my life were replaced by a newfound calm. Mark and I stayed in touch, and he reported that his nightmares had finally ceased. It seemed that the cleansing and the historical resolution had provided the closure we both needed. The building, once a source of terror, had been transformed into a place of peace. The experience had changed me profoundly. I had faced my deepest fears and uncovered the hidden darkness that had haunted me. The ordeal had taught me the importance of confronting the past and addressing the sources of our fears. As I moved forward, I remained vigilant but hopeful. The entity was no longer a part of my life, and the building's curse had been lifted. I had found strength in the face of terror and discovered that even in the darkest moments, there is a path to light and understanding. And though the nightmares were behind me, I knew that the journey had left an indelible mark. The shadows of the past had been confronted, but the echoes of the experience would remain with me, a reminder of the darkness that once lurked just beyond the veil of reality. Have you ever driven down a road late at night and felt like you weren't alone? Like something or someone was watching you from the shadows, following your every move? I used to think stories like that were nothing but myths, urban legends designed to scare people. That was until I experienced it myself. It was a cool, quiet evening in late October when I first saw her. The road stretched out before me, a winding, desolate path cutting through the dense woods. I was driving home from a friend's house after a long day, the kind of night where you just want to relax and forget about everything. The car's headlights illuminated the trees on either side, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered in the corners of my vision. But I wasn't scared, not yet, anyway. I'd taken this road dozens of times before. It was a shortcut to my place, a lonely stretch that few others used, but that saved me a good 10 minutes on the drive. That night, though, it felt different. The air seemed heavier, like something was hanging over me, pressing down on my chest. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the fatigue from the day. But as I rounded a bend, something caught my eye. A figure stood at the edge of the road, barely visible in the dim light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, maybe a tree or an animal, but as I got closer, I could make out the shape of a woman. She was standing perfectly still, her back facing me, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned white dress. My heart skipped a beat. What was she doing out here? There were no houses nearby, no reason for anyone to be walking along this road at this hour. I slowed the car, my eyes fixed on her. As I passed, she didn't move, didn't turn to look at me. It was like she didn't even know I was there. Something about her felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I pressed down on the gas, eager to get away, and glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw her face. She was staring right at me, her eyes wide and dark, filled with something I can only describe as sorrow. But it wasn't just sadness, it was something deeper, something that made my blood run cold. Her expression was blank, her skin pale, almost translucent in the light from my taillights. For a moment, our eyes locked, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Then, just as quickly as I had seen her, she was gone. I jerked my head back around, scanning the road behind me. But there was no one there. The road was empty. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the light, or maybe just my tired mind playing games with me? I wanted to believe that. I really did. but deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the image of that woman from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those haunting eyes staring back at me, full of sorrow and something else I couldn't quite name. It got to the point where I started avoiding that road altogether. I took the longer way home, even if it meant adding extra time to my drive. I just couldn't bring myself to go back there. But as it turns out, I wasn't the only one who had seen her. It was a few weeks later, at a local diner, when I overheard a conversation that sent chills down my spine. Two older men were sitting at the table next to mine, talking about a ghost woman people I'd been seeing on the old highway. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe a local ghost story I hadn't heard before. But then one of the men described her, the white dress, the dark eyes, the way she just stood there, staring at you as you drove by. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was no coincidence. I had seen her, too. Curiosity got the better of me, and I leaned over, interrupting their conversation. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual despite the unease bubbling up inside me. "You were talking about a woman on the road. Do you know anything more about her?" The men exchanged glances, and one of them, an older guy with a grizzled beard, nodded. "Yeah, lots of folks around here have seen her. Been going on for years, since the accident." My heart skipped a beat. "Accident?" He nodded again, his expression growing somber. "Happened maybe 15 years ago, give or take. Young woman was driving home late one night, just like you, on that same stretch of road. Lost control of her car and went off the side. They say she died instantly, but ever since, people have been seeing her. Always at night, always in that same white dress." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Do they know why she's still there?" The man shrugged. "Some say she's looking for help, or maybe for someone to take her home. Others think she doesn't even know she's dead, just stuck, reliving that last night over and over again." A cold shiver ran down my spine. It made sense, in a way, her blank expression, the way she had just stood there, as if waiting for something. Or someone. I thanked the men and left the diner, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the possibility that she was still out there, trapped on that lonely road, waiting for someone to help her move on. I didn't believe in ghosts before that night, but now I wasn't so sure. A few days passed before I finally worked up the nerve to drive that road again. I don't know what I was hoping to find, maybe some kind of closure, or maybe just proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Either way, I knew I had to go back. I had to see her again. The night I chose was cold and foggy, the kind of weather that clings to your skin and seeps into your bones. The road was as desolate as ever, the trees on either side looming like dark sentinels. I drove slowly, my eyes scanning the edges of the road for any sign of her. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the sound of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I was starting to think I had imagined the whole thing when I saw her. She was standing in the same spot as before, her back to me, the white dress almost glowing in the moonlight. My heart leapt into my throat. I slowed the car to a crawl, afraid to get too close, but unable to turn away. This time, I didn't just drive past. I stopped. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle, but something, curiosity, or maybe a strange sense of duty, compelled me to step out. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I barely noticed. All my attention was focused on her. "Hello?" My voice sounded weak, barely more than a whisper in the stillness. She didn't move. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Are you okay?" Nothing. Finally, I was close enough to see her clearly. Her hair was long and dark, hanging limply over her shoulders. The dress she wore was tattered, stained with what looked like dirt, or maybe something else. But it was her face that stopped me in my tracks. Her eyes were wide and empty, her skin pale as death. And yet, there was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of my memory. Before I could react, she turned and started walking, slowly and deliberately, toward the edge of the road. Toward the trees. Toward the darkness. Without thinking, I followed. That's all for now. Let me know if you're ready for the next part. I followed her into the trees, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. The air grew colder the farther we went, the shadows thickening around us, swallowing the faint light from the road behind. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but my feet kept moving, as if drawn by some invisible force. She walked slowly, her movements deliberate, almost mechanical. The further we went, the more my surroundings seemed to change. The woods, which had been so familiar moments ago, felt foreign, like I was stepping into another world. The air felt thicker, and the silence was almost suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as I kept my eyes locked on the woman in front of me. "Wait," I called out, my voice sounding small and far away in the oppressive stillness. "Where are you going?" She didn't respond, didn't even turn to look at me. She just kept moving, her white dress flowing behind her like some spectral veil. I wanted to stop, to turn back to the safety of my car, but I couldn't. Something inside me told me I had to see this through, had to know where she was leading me. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched in the faint light. And there, at the center of the clearing, was a car. My breath caught in my throat. It was an old model, rusted and covered in dirt, as if it had been sitting there for years. The front was crumpled, the windshield shattered, and the passenger side door was open, hanging crooked on its hinges. I didn't need to get closer to know what had happened here. This was the accident. Her accident. She finally stopped, standing just a few feet from the wreck, her back still to me. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the overwhelming sadness that clung to the air. I took a step forward, my hands trembling. This is where it happened, isn't it? For the first time since I'd seen her, she moved. Slowly, she turned to face me, her eyes wide and filled with that same haunting sorrow. But this time, there was something else there too, recognition. It was as if she was seeing me for the first time, truly seeing me. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "Why? Why are you still here?" She stared at me for a long moment, her gaze piercing, before she finally spoke. "I didn't make it home." Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. It was the first time I had heard her speak, and there was something in her tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just sadness, it was desperation. I looked back at the car, at the wreck that had ended her life. "Is that why you've been wandering the road? You're trying to get home?" She nodded, a single, slow movement that felt heavy with the weight of years spent in limbo. A lump formed in my throat as I realized the full extent of her torment. She wasn't just some restless spirit haunting the road out of malice or revenge. She was lost, trapped in the moment of her death, unable to move on because she had never made it home. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. Her eyes flickered, a faint glimmer of something passing through them, gratitude, maybe, or understanding. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she began to fade. Her form grew less solid, her edges blurring until she was little more than a shadow, a ghost of the woman she had once been. I watched in stunned silence as she disappeared, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on my chest. The clearing was quiet again, the wreck of the car the only reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded here so many years ago. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the spot where she had vanished. The air felt lighter now, the oppressive atmosphere that had followed me since I first saw her finally lifting. But the sadness lingered, a deep ache in my chest for the woman who had never made it home. Eventually, I made my way back to the car, my mind still reeling from everything I had just experienced. The drive home was quiet, the road empty, as it always had been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something in the air, in the very fabric of the road itself. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me, but it lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the encounter I couldn't explain. I thought about her often, about the woman on the road, and wondered if she had finally found peace, or if she would return to that lonely stretch of highway, forever searching for the home she would never reach. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal, until one night, I heard it again. A friend of mine, driving the same road late at night, told me he'd seen a woman standing at the side of the road. A woman in a white dress, her back turned to him as he passed. I didn't have the heart to tell him what I knew, that no matter how many times she disappears, she will always come back. Because some ghosts never find their way home. I couldn't shake the weight of the story. Weeks had passed since I last saw her, and yet she lingered in my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the fact that I had seen a ghost, it was the profound sadness in her eyes, the unspoken pain that clung to the air around her. I found myself wondering if she had truly moved on, or if she was still out there, wandering that lonely road, forever searching for something she would never find. Then, one night, everything changed. I was sitting in my living room, staring blankly at the TV, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a friend of mine, Mark, who lived on the outskirts of town. We hadn't spoken much recently, but he knew about my encounter on the road. He'd been skeptical at first, brushing it off as a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But now, his message was different, urgent, almost frantic. "Hey, man. I think I just saw her. The woman. On the road." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly texted back. "Where? What happened?" The reply came almost instantly. "I was driving home. Same spot you told me about. I saw her standing on the side of the road, just like you said. White dress, dark hair, but something's wrong. She was closer this time, like she wanted me to stop. I didn't, though. I kept driving." I could feel my pulse quicken as I read his words. Something about this felt different, like the story wasn't over yet, like she wasn't done with us. I had a sinking feeling that she was trying to communicate something, but I didn't know what. The thought that she might be trying to reach out to more than just me sent a cold chill down my spine. Mark wasn't the type to scare easily, but there was a nervousness in his text that made me realize he was shaken up. I could picture him, sitting in his car, hands trembling as he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. "Are you okay?" I texted back, my fingers moving quickly across the screen. His reply was delayed this time, and when it finally came, it was short. I don't know, man. I can't stop thinking about her. I knew exactly how he felt. The image of her, standing there by the side of the road, was burned into my mind. I had tried to forget, tried to move on, but she was always there, lurking in the back of my thoughts, a constant reminder of that night. The next few days were tense. Mark and I spoke a few more times, and each conversation left me feeling more unsettled. He told me he kept seeing her in his dreams, always the same, always standing there, staring at him with those empty, sorrowful eyes. He said it felt like she was trying to tell him something, but he couldn't figure out what. I didn't know what to tell him. Part of me wanted to believe that it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that he was projecting my story onto his own experiences. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. A week later, Mark called me in the middle of the night. I saw her again, he said, his voice trembling. It was after midnight, and I was barely awake, but the urgency in his voice jolted me out of my haze. What happened? I don't know. I was driving home, same as before. But this time she was standing right in the middle of the road. I almost hit her. I sat up straight, the blood draining from my face. Did you stop? He hesitated. No. I couldn't. Something about her, it felt wrong. Like she wanted me to stop, but at the same time, I was terrified of what would happen if I did. A cold chill ran through me. Did she look different this time? Yeah, Mark whispered. She wasn't just standing there anymore. She was reaching out. Like she wanted me to pull over and help her. I didn't know what to say. Everything inside me screamed that something bad was coming, that whatever was happening on that road was far from over. But what could we do? We weren't ghost hunters or psychics. We were just two guys trying to understand something far beyond our control. The following night, I made a decision I never thought I would. I texted Mark and told him to meet me at the diner near the highway. I couldn't just sit back and let this haunt both of us. We had to figure out what was going on. Whether that meant finding a way to help her or something else, I didn't know. But we couldn't keep running from it. Mark agreed, reluctantly. He didn't like the idea of going back, but he trusted me enough to follow through. So, at midnight, we met at the diner, the neon sign flickering in the cold night air. We didn't say much. There wasn't anything to say. We both knew why we were there, and we both felt the weight of the night pressing down on us. After a few minutes of silence, I spoke. We need to go back. To the spot where you saw her. Mark stared at me, his face pale. Are you serious? I nodded. We need to figure out what she wants. Otherwise, this is never going to stop. He looked down at the table, clearly torn. But after a long pause, he nodded. Okay, let's do it. The drive to the spot was tense, the silence between us filled with the unspoken fear of what we might find. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I navigated the winding road, my eyes constantly flicking to the edges of the trees, half expecting to see her at any moment. We finally reached the spot, the place where both Mark and I had seen her before. I pulled over to the side of the road, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. For a long moment, we just sat there, neither of us moving, both waiting for something to happen. And then, we saw her. She appeared out of the darkness, stepping into the glow of the headlights, her white dress fluttering in the cold night breeze. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her move, her figure ghostly and ethereal, just as I remembered. But this time, there was something different. She wasn't standing still, waiting for us to pass by. She was walking toward us. Mark gasped beside me, his eyes wide with fear. What do we do? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that this time, she wasn't just a passive figure in the distance. She was coming for us. And as she drew closer, I realized that there was no escaping this. Not anymore. She moved with a slow, deliberate pace, her eyes locked on us through the windshield. The closer she got, the heavier the air felt inside the car. It was like the weight of her sorrow was seeping through the glass, pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. Mark was trembling beside me. We should leave. Let's get out of here, man. But I couldn't move. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. Something about the way she was looking at us made it impossible to turn away. It wasn't just fear holding me in place, it was something deeper, something that felt almost like pity. She stopped just a few feet from the car, her figure illuminated in the harsh beam of the headlights. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the light, and her dark hair fell in messy waves over her shoulders. Her dress, once white, now looked dirty and torn, as if she'd been wandering these woods for years. For a moment, everything was still. The world around us seemed to freeze, the wind dying down, the trees standing motionless. It was just the three of us, locked in this strange, eerie standoff. Then, without warning, she lifted her hand and pointed directly at me. I felt a cold shock run through my body, as if her gesture had physically touched me. Mark gasped beside me, his eyes wide with terror. What does she want? I didn't know. But I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of the car, to face her directly. I glanced at Mark, who looked like he was on the verge of panic. Stay here, I whispered. What? No. Are you insane? We need to leave. But I was already opening the door, stepping out into the cold night air. My legs felt weak, shaky, but I forced myself to stand, my eyes never leaving hers. She was so close now, I could see the details of her face, her hollow cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her lips were slightly parted, as if she were about to speak. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, closing the distance between us. My heart was racing, every instinct in my body screaming at me to get back in the car and drive away, but something stronger kept me moving toward her. I had to know what she wanted. Who are you? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, recognition, maybe, or relief. Then she lowered her hand and took a step back, as if inviting me to follow. Without thinking, I took another step toward her. And then another. My body felt like it was moving on autopilot, like I wasn't in control anymore. She turned and started walking, her movements slow and deliberate, and I followed, leading the car and Mark behind. The trees closed in around us as we moved deeper into the woods. The headlights from the car were now just a distant glow, barely visible through the thick branches. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the faint rustle of the wind in the trees. She didn't speak, but I could feel her presence guiding me, leading me somewhere. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew I had to follow. There was something unfinished here, something that needed to be resolved, and I was the only one who could help her. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The air grew colder the farther we went, and the trees seemed to press in closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I kept my eyes on her, afraid that if I looked away, she would disappear, and I would be lost in the woods forever. Finally, we came to a stop. She stood in front of me, silent and still, her back to me once again. I looked around, trying to understand where she had brought me. And then I saw it. There, half buried under a thick layer of leaves and dirt, was another car. An old, rusted vehicle, just like the one I had seen in the clearing before. But this one was different. The passenger side door was hanging open, and inside, slumped over the steering wheel, was the decayed form of a woman. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest as I peered into the wreckage. The body was long decomposed, little more than a skeleton now, but the torn white dress clinging to its bones told me everything I needed to know. It was her. I stumbled back, my mind racing, struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman standing in front of me, the ghost I had followed, was the same woman lying dead in the car. I looked at her, my mouth dry, my voice barely audible. Is this you?" She turned to face me, her expression soft, sad. And then, slowly, she nodded. I felt a wave of sorrow crash over me, almost knocking me off my feet. She had died here, alone, forgotten. No one had found her. No one had known she was missing. And now, all these years later, she was still wandering, trapped between life and death, searching for someone, anyone, to acknowledge her existence. Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at her. "I'm so sorry." She didn't respond, but there was something in her eyes, something like gratitude. It was as if, in finally being seen, she could let go. Slowly, her form began to fade, her body becoming more translucent with each passing second. I wanted to reach out, to stop her, to say something more, but I knew it wasn't necessary. She had found peace. And then, just like that, she was gone. The woods around me were suddenly quiet, the air still and calm. The weight that had been pressing down on my chest for weeks was finally lifted. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the place where she had vanished, trying to process everything that had just happened. When I finally made my way back to the car, Mark was sitting in the driver's seat, his face pale, his hands shaking. "What the hell happened?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. I didn't know how to explain it. "She's gone," I said quietly. "She's finally gone." We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. And then, without a word, Mark started the car, and we drove away, leaving the haunted road behind us. But even as the highway stretched out before us, I knew I would never forget her, the woman on the road, the ghost who had been lost for so long. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling and the road is empty, I wonder if she really found her way home. Or if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to follow her into the darkness. The demon from the depths of the lake. Have you ever felt the chilling gaze of something lurking just beneath the surface? The kind of feeling that creeps under your skin, making every hair on your body stand on end? I still remember the summer of 2023 like it was yesterday. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over our small lakeside town of Eldridge. It was a time of tranquility, where fishing trips were a staple of our weekends, and the lake was our sanctuary. Little did we know that serenity would soon shatter, unveiling something that lay dormant in the depths. It began with whispers among the local fishermen, tales of a creature surfacing from the lake's dark abyss. At first, I brushed it off as mere superstition, a ghost story spun by old men seeking to entertain the young. Yet, as the weeks passed, I noticed something peculiar. The air around the lake grew heavier, thick with an unshakable tension. One balmy evening, I decided to join my friend Tom on a fishing trip. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. We settled on the shore, our lines cast into the murky waters, the rhythmic sound of lapping waves a soothing backdrop. But even in that serene moment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Tom, noticing my unease, chuckled, "What's got you all jumpy?" "Just the fish below, man." But I could sense it too, an oppressive energy emanating from the depths. The surface rippled unnaturally, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something, a dark shape, darting just out of view. I dismissed it, blaming my overactive imagination. As the night grew darker, the forest surrounding us became a symphony of sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. Yet, there was something else, an unsettling silence that settled intermittently, like the calm before a storm. It felt as though the entire world held its breath. Suddenly, a loud splash shattered the stillness. My heart raced as I turned to see Tom's eyes widen in shock. "Did you see that?" he exclaimed, pointing toward the water. "What? Just a fish?" I replied, though doubt crept into my voice. But as I peered closer, I could make out the unmistakable outline of something massive beneath the surface, a form that defied the very laws of nature. It was then that the first tendrils of fear gripped my heart. Tom and I sat in silence, our fishing rods forgotten, tension thick in the air. Every instinct screamed at us to leave, but curiosity rooted us to our spots. That's when it happened. A grotesque head broke through the water, slick and glistening in the moonlight. It was nothing like I had ever seen, scales shimmering like obsidian, and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. "Run!" Tom shouted, panic radiating from him. We scrambled to our feet, adrenaline surging through my veins as we bolted toward the safety of the shore. But as I glanced back, the creature submerged, leaving only ripples in its wake, taunting us with its mere existence. Once home, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I replayed it over and over, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or some bizarre hallucination. But the fear lingered, a gnawing sensation that haunted my dreams. Days turned into weeks, and the lake became an enigma. Fishermen began to disappear. First, it was old Mr. Jacobs, who had fished there every Sunday for decades. Then, a young couple on their honeymoon vanished without a trace. The townsfolk whispered, a hushed urgency in their voices. Some claimed it was a demon from the depths, others believed it to be the wrath of the lake itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to that fateful night, the night I first glimpsed the demon lurking below. Determined to uncover the truth, I began my own investigation. I interviewed locals, piecing together the scattered fragments of lore and myth surrounding the lake. They spoke of ancient rituals performed by the indigenous people who once thrived in this area, rituals meant to appease the spirits of the water. I felt a chill run down my spine. What if the demon was their wrath, awakened after years of neglect? I spent countless nights researching, diving into the town's history, unearthing accounts that detailed the lake's dark past. It was said that many had gone missing, drawn to the water's edge by a mysterious force, never to be seen again. I couldn't shake the feeling that the demon was more than just a myth. It was real, and it was angry. One night, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to return to the lake alone, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my growing dread. The moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the water with an eerie glow. I stood at the water's edge, heart pounding, the silence pressing against my ears. "Show yourself," I whispered, half hoping, half fearing a response. The water remained still, mocking my bravery. But then, the surface began to ripple, a small wave forming as if something stirred beneath. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was happening again. My instinct screamed at me to flee, yet a strange compulsion held me there, entranced by the unknown. Suddenly, a powerful wave surged from the depths, splashing against my legs, sending cold shockwaves through my body. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I fell onto the wet grass. And then I saw it, the demon rising from the water, its massive form breaking the surface with a sound like thunder. It towered above me, a grotesque blend of fish and something otherworldly. I could see every detail, the jagged teeth, the pulsating gills, the eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Fear paralyzed me as I stared into the depths of its gaze. It was then I realized, it wasn't just anger I saw, but a deep-seated sorrow, a yearning for something lost. In that moment, I felt a strange connection, as if the creature was trying to convey something. I remembered the stories of the lake, the rituals meant to honor it. Could it be that the demon sought retribution for the disrespect it had endured for years? As I pondered this, a memory washed over me, my grandmother's tales of the lake, of the people who had once revered it. She had always spoken of balance, of respecting the forces of nature, of giving thanks. Was this creature a guardian, an ancient spirit defending its domain? The realization shook me to my core. The fear I had felt transformed into something else, an overwhelming sense of empathy. I wanted to help it, to restore what had been lost. But how? Suddenly, the water began to churn violently. The demon thrashed, and I stumbled back, fear flooding my senses once more. It was as if my moment of clarity had enraged it. The lake roared in response, waves crashing against the shore like a tempest unleashed. With every ounce of courage I had left, I shouted, "I'm here to help. I'll do whatever it takes." The words echoed into the night, swallowed by the darkness. To my surprise, the demon paused, its eyes locking onto mine, as if processing my plea. Then, slowly, it retreated into the depths, the water calming in its wake. I stood there, breathless and trembling, the weight of the moment sinking in. What had just happened? Had I truly connected with a demon? Returning to town, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I gathered the community, sharing my experience, urging them to acknowledge the lake's history, to respect it as we once did. Many were skeptical, but a few rallied, wanting to revive the old rituals, to offer a tribute to the spirits of the water. As we gathered by the lake one moonlit night, I felt the air shift. We performed the ceremony my grandmother had once described, honoring the lake with offerings of flowers and incense. As we concluded, a serene stillness enveloped us, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. But just as we thought we had appeased the demon, a rumble echoed from the depths. The water began to swell again, and my heart dropped. I had been wrong, perhaps it was too late. The surface erupted, and the demon reappeared, more powerful than before. This time, it roared, the sound reverberating through our very souls, sending waves of terror crashing over us. In that moment, I understood, this was no mere creature, it was a force of nature, a guardian of the lake's forgotten history. And we had disturbed its slumber. The townsfolk screamed, panic engulfing the gathering. I felt rooted to the spot, caught between fear and regret. What had I awakened? As the demon surged forth, the water splashed violently, engulfing everything in its path. I stumbled back, realizing that we had brought this upon ourselves. In an unexpected twist, as I turned to flee, I glanced back one last time. The demon, instead of wreaking havoc, seemed to be retreating, dragging the water with it, as if protecting the very essence of the lake. It vanished beneath the surface, leaving us in stunned silence, the lake now eerily calm. But the tranquility was deceptive. In the days that followed, Eldridge changed. The lake remained, but it felt different, haunted, as if the demon's presence lingered just beneath. The surface. People spoke in hushed tones about what had transpired that night, and the whispers grew louder. It was as if the lake itself was a portal to another world, one that we were never meant to disturb. The next morning, the sun rose with an unsettling brightness, illuminating the town with an eerie glow. I ventured out to the lake, compelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity. The water was still, but an undercurrent of tension was palpable in the air. I could see the reflections of trees and clouds, but there was something off, a distortion that made it look like the lake was holding its breath. I noticed old Mr. McKinley sitting on his porch, staring out at the water. I approached him, hoping to glean some wisdom from his years of experience. "What do you think we stirred up?" I asked, my voice low. He looked at me with weary eyes, his face lined with years of worry. "Son, the lake has secrets. It always has. Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it." His words weighed heavily on my mind as I turned to gaze at the water. The ripples seemed to dance mischievously, as if taunting us. I could feel the pull of the lake, a siren song that called to me, begging for attention. Days turned into weeks, and life in Eldridge settled into an uneasy normalcy. Some residents returned to fishing, but many stayed away, haunted by the memory of the demon. I found myself increasingly drawn to the lake, feeling an inexplicable need to understand what lay beneath. Each visit, I could sense a change, an energy coursing through the water that resonated deep within me. One evening, I decided to return to the spot where I first encountered the creature. Armed with a camera and a notebook, I hoped to document any further signs of its presence. The air was thick with anticipation, the fading light casting long shadows that seemed to reach out toward me. As dusk descended, the lake transformed into a mirror, reflecting the twilight sky. But then, the water began to ripple again, and my heart raced. I instinctively raised my camera, capturing the moment. The splashes grew louder, and out of the depths, the demon emerged once more, its massive form breaking the surface with a thunderous crash. This time, however, it didn't roar. It merely stared at me, those glowing eyes locking onto mine, filled with a sorrow that pierced through my very soul. It felt almost vulnerable. "Please," I whispered, "I want to help you." The creature's gaze softened, and for a moment, I believed it understood. I remembered the rituals of the past, and I began to chant softly, invoking the old ways. The water shimmered in response, a ripple of energy flowing toward the demon as if it were responding to my call. But just as hope surged within me, a dark cloud rolled over the lake, casting everything into shadow. I looked up, and to my horror, I saw figures emerging from the trees, specters from the past. The spirits of those who had vanished into the lake. They hovered above the water, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Fear surged through me as I realized the truth. These were the souls of the fishermen, the lost who had been drawn to the demon's power. I turned back to the creature, a realization dawning on me. "It's not just you," I cried. "You're not alone." The demon thrashed, as if sensing the spirits surrounding it. The lake churned violently, waves crashing against the shore. I struggled to hold my ground, feeling the pull of the depths trying to drag me in. The spirits began to wail, their sorrow echoing across the water. I felt a wave of despair wash over me, a weight so heavy it threatened to crush me. I could hear their cries of anguish, their desperate pleas for release. Suddenly, it hit me. They weren't just victims, they were connected to the demon, bound to it in a way I couldn't fully understand. I needed to break that bond. With every ounce of courage I had left, I shouted into the storm, "I won't let you take any more. You deserve peace." The demon paused, its gaze shifting between me and the spirits. I could feel the tension in the air, a battle of wills playing out before my eyes. I continued chanting, louder this time, urging the spirits to find their strength. As the last words escaped my lips, the demon let out a roar that shook the very foundation of the earth. A surge of power erupted from the depths, sending waves crashing over me. The spirits began to shimmer, their forms solidifying for a moment as they reached toward the demon, drawn together by an unseen force. "Let go!" I cried, desperate for them to find their release. "You don't belong here." The air crackled with energy, and in an instant, the spirits surged forward, colliding with the demon. A blinding light engulfed the lake, and for a heartbeat, I was suspended in time. I felt a rush of emotions, fear, sadness, anger, but amidst it all, there was hope. As the light faded, I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. The lake was calm once more, the demon nowhere to be seen. The spirits had vanished, leaving only silence in their wake. I looked around, half expecting the apparition to reappear, but nothing stirred. It was as if the lake had swallowed the truth, holding its secrets close. The realization hit me then. I had faced something far beyond my comprehension. The lake had taken its toll, and though the demon was gone, its legacy would remain etched in the town's history. In the weeks that followed, life in Eldridge returned to a fragile peace. The lake's dark allure remained, but it was now accompanied by a newfound respect. Fishermen returned, but they cast their lines cautiously, aware of the depths that hid both beauty and danger. I often found myself returning to the shore, contemplating the events of that fateful night. The lake had taught me a lesson about balance, a reminder that nature is both a friend and a foe. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood at the water's edge. The surface shimmered under the twilight, and for a brief moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of something beneath, a shadow darting away, as if it were watching, waiting. "Thank you," I whispered to the depths, feeling a strange connection. Perhaps the demon had found its peace after all, and in my heart, I hoped it would guard the lake forever, ensuring that its secrets remained protected. But deep down, I knew the truth. The depths of the lake would always hold mysteries, waiting for the next curious soul to venture too close. And I could only wonder what they might awaken. Waken. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.